Chapter 797. Misunderstanding my ass. This lord discovered Mongolian spies here, and we're going to conduct a search. If you're tactful and cooperate, we can lessen your punishment. Otherwise, we'll throw you into the imperial prison and let you know that sometimes, even death is a beautiful thing. Revealing a ferocious expression, Jean Buchuan used his croaky voice to threaten the steward who followed him. The manager was clearly frightened. He didn't know what to say for a moment. Don't say this and that. Let me tell you, cooperate with us or we'll arrest you right now. All right, I'll give you a chance. Go up to the 3rd floor and invite all the guests out. Tong Lai stepped up to the manager's side and flashed the spring-embroidered blade in his hand. He looked like he really would kill at the slightest provocation. This really did scare the manager. Afraid of death, he could only nod. Fine, I'll cooperate with you. With the manager leading the way, the waiters on the 3rd floor naturally didn't dare stop them. Jean Buchuan, Tong Lai, and the others smoothly arrived on the 3rd floor. Afterwards, they began to clear out the rooms one by one. Those who could dine on the 3rd floor naturally all had the highest membership cards. Their statuses were also different from ordinary people. They were eating here, but the Immortal Abode's manager suddenly asked them to leave first. Of course, they were all extremely dissatisfied. Those with bad tempers immediately began to curse. However, as the embroidered uniform guards in flying robes appeared one after another, they all shut their mouths. Just a while ago, the genie guards had even arrested the eldest son of Minister Hu Xianshu. He was also the genie guards' town commissioner. He was one of their own. However, when he made a move, he did not show any mercy. What were they? They had angered him. So what if he killed them on the spot? They were still dissatisfied, but they didn't show it. They only snorted coldly and walked out of the room. Jean Buchuan didn't even bother to look at the dissatisfaction shown by these people. He only asked Tong Lai, "How is it? Did you find that Mongolian?" "No, none of these people are Mongolians." Tong Lai stared intently. He was confident that as long as that person appeared, he would be able to recognize him. He would never make a mistake. Just like that, the private rooms were emptied one after another. More and more people walked out of the room, but they still couldn't find any trace of that person. For a moment, Tong Lai wasn't as confident as before. Layers of cold sweat began to form on his forehead. "My lord, there's only one room left. Please take a look." That manager looked at Jean Buchuan as if his parents had died and spoke in a pleading tone. "The last room needs to be searched even more. The person we're looking for might be here." Jean Buchuan did not show any signs of stopping. With such a big fuss, if he returned without any results, it was likely that not long after, a memorial to impeach him would appear on the Emperor's dragon table. He didn't want to be punished, and his mind was in a mess. He had completely forgotten that the Duke of Loyalty was currently eating in the Immortal Abode. Seeing how unreasonable Jean Buchuan was, the manager could only lead 2 embroidered uniform guards to knock on the door of the final private room. Without waiting for permission to be emitted from within, they pushed open the door and entered. Soon after, 3 figures flew out. Tong tong. The figures landed on the floor, causing the entire floor to tremble. However, this also caused Jean Buchuan and Tong Lai's eyes to brighten. "Ha! They actually dared to make an enemy out of our embroidered uniform guards. They must be the people we're looking for. Attack together. Capture them." At this moment, the 2 of them only had eyes for the Mongol agents they were looking for. All other problems had been thrown to the back of their minds. This was a solid achievement, a good opportunity for them to rise in rank and make a fortune. As the 2 of them roared, the embroidered uniform guards behind them also charged forward. This was Baiming's capital, and their intelligence reports had said that the Mongol agents were secretly meeting. There shouldn't be too many of them, only 2 or 3 at most. They had more than 10 people in total, so what was there to be afraid of? In order to become an embroidered uniform guard, one had to undergo a strict test in terms of skill. Even if some people had special talents, they still had to undergo frequent training after entering the organization. After all, when it came to a crucial moment, when they fought with others, they wouldn't care about their status. If they were too weak and let the enemy escape from under their noses, wouldn't that be a slap in the face? The group of embroidered uniform guards, who prided themselves on being elites, pulled out their spring-embroidered sabers and charged into the private room one after another. However, they didn't know what kind of elites they were going to face next. They were the kind of cold vanguards who were 5 to 10 times stronger than the embroidered uniform guards. They were the kind of veterans who had fought countless battles on the battlefield and were still unscathed. Yes, this private room was Sky Room number 1. It was the place where Yang Chendong, 2nd Madam, and 4th Madam were eating together. Considering that he was eating with Madam, Yang Chendong didn't bring too many people. However, since they were in a foreign place, the other guards were arranged to go downstairs. Beta Persei, Yang Si, Badeo Jiang, Peng Yu, and Shibi were still in the private room. The 5 of them weren't bad at fighting. The only problem was that Shibi was a little thin because of long-term malnutrition. However, when it came to fighting skills, 2 or 3 ordinary embroidered uniform guards couldn't take him down. Of course, the figure who had led Tong Lai away was him. This was also the task Yang Chendong had arranged for him early in the morning. Letting a Han and Mongolian mixed-blood general who had lived in Mongolia for a long time play the role of a Mongolian spy, no one would be able to see any flaws. After the mission was completed, Shibi entered Sky Room number 1 and put on a set of black armor that had been stored there for a long time. After changing his clothes, his entire temperament immediately changed. Even though they were face to face, Tong Lai couldn't tell the difference between this person and a Han, nor could he tell the relationship between him and a Mongolian. When Jin Buchuan and Tong Lai reached the 3rd floor, chaos broke out outside. Yang Chendong, who was eating with the 2 madams, knew that the fish had taken the bait. However, he didn't panic in the slightest. On the contrary, he continued to drink with the madams in the private room, as if he didn't care at all about what was happening outside. With Yang Chendong's current status, it would be too shameful for him to personally take part in the fighting. He left it for Beta Persei and the others to deal with. Knowing that something unexpected might happen, but knowing that everything was under control, Beta Persei and the others naturally rolled up their sleeves and prepared to go all out. When the door was pushed open from the outside, everyone began to move without a word. Not only were the first 2 embroidered uniform guards sent flying, even the manager of the immortal abode who had been forced to lead the way was sent flying with a kick. After beating up the first group, this was only the beginning. More and more embroidered uniform guards rushed in, brandishing their swords as they attacked. They didn't care at all, and their attitudes were extremely arrogant. Normally, Beta Persei and the others were at the 6th young master's side. Wherever they went, they were respected. Even when facing enemies, they didn't show the slightest bit of fear, let alone these dozen or so embroidered uniform guards. Naturally, they wouldn't be polite. If you don't report your name, then we don't have to ask. Let's beat you up first. Ding ding dang dang. After a few exchanges, all of the embroidered uniform guards who had rushed in were knocked to the ground. Only Jin Buchuan and Tong Lai were still standing. Even Chen Guo, who had been mixed in with the crowd, had been knocked to the ground. Blood was still dripping from the corner of her mouth. It looked so real. The security bureau was a vertical management. Perhaps Yang Chendong already knew Chen Guo's identity, or perhaps he didn't. However, Beta Persei and the others definitely didn't know. Therefore, when they attacked just now, they didn't hold back at all. This was actually the perfect disguise. 10 embroidered uniform guard brothers were knocked to the ground. This scene caused Jin Buchuan's chest to heave up and down. Quite a few of these people were wearing the uniform of the embroidered uniform guard. He did not believe that the other party could not see through their identities. Even if they knew, they still dared to attack. Just based on this, these people deserved to die. Jin Buchuan's eyes flashed with anger. He already regarded the people in front of him as dead. The only one standing beside him, Tong Lai, also had a face full of anger. They were embroidered uniform guards. Even if they rushed into a minister's house to arrest someone, no one would dare to stop them. Now, they were actually beaten in a restaurant. How could he take this lying down? Although the other party's aura seemed to be stronger at this moment, and 3 of the 5 people were wearing black armor, giving off a very fierce feeling, he still angrily rebuked, "Who are you people? Do you know that we're embroidered uniform guards handling a case?" "We don't know." Beta Persei, who was wearing ordinary civilian clothes, was the first to step forward. Then, he looked at Tong Lai and said in a tone that didn't show any signs of backing down, "This is a place to eat. Who are you to dare to trespass here?" Needless to say, you're clearly not good people. Yang Si, who was wearing civilian clothes, also took a step forward and said, "For more than a year, the embroidered uniform guards had been pressuring the Yang family's forces step by step. Although they didn't do anything excessive because Yang Qindong was outside, it was only the result of restraint on both sides. Because of this, he didn't know how much anger he had suppressed in his heart. Now that he finally had a chance to vent it, he had to seize it properly. In a very short period of time, the two people exchanged questions and answers. In particular, they directly pointed out that the embroidered uniform guards were not good people. This angered Tong Lai. If it weren't for the fact that they looked strong, he would have directly raised his sword and cut them down. Fortunately, he didn't forget that he still had Jin Buchuan behind him, so he didn't make a decision on his own. Instead, he turned around and looked awkwardly. Jin Buchuan was also furious. Commoners knew not to scold bald thieves in front of monks. Now, these people actually dared to say that the embroidered uniform guards were not good people in front of the embroidered uniform guards. If he didn't show the toughness he should have, once this matter spread out, how could he establish himself in the future? Chapter 798. In his anger, when he saw Tong Lai looking at him, his face flushed red as he said, "Why are you looking at me? Do I need to tell you the consequences of obstructing the embroidered uniform guards from handling a case?" "Ah, there's no need." Tong Lai immediately understood Jin Buchuan's meaning. He recalled how he personally went to the Hu estate to capture Hu Zhangning a few days ago. How could he admit defeat now? After hearing Jin Buchuan's words, he seemed to be filled with courage. He waved the shining embroidered spring saber in his hand in midair and shouted, "We, the embroidered uniform guards, are going to investigate a case. All of you scram. Anyone who blocks our way will be killed without mercy." As he spoke, Tong Lai strode forward. His target was the inner room. He believed that the person hiding inside was the Mongolian he saw earlier. As long as he could find this person, he would have the upper hand in this matter. Tong Lai walked forward courageously, as if he was the boss. However, an arm suddenly reached out from beside him. Before he could react, the embroidered spring saber in his hand was taken away. Then, with a backhand slash, the blade slapped Tong Lai's arm. The intense pain caused him to cry out in pain. His body also staggered back a few steps. "Rebel! Rebel! Just you wait. I will kill all of you. I will also kill your entire family." Seeing that there was someone who dared to obstruct the embroidered uniform guards from investigating a case, Jin Buchuan roared hysterically in anger. Then, he decisively turned around and left. As the saying goes, a wise man knows better than to fight when the odds are against him. He wanted to gather more embroidered uniform guards. He wanted to kill all of these people. Not a single one of them would be left alive. Jin Buchuan had always been high and mighty. He couldn't see the situation in front of him clearly and thought that he could walk out unscathed. However, he forgot one thing. Sometimes, even if he didn't find trouble with others, it didn't mean that others wouldn't find trouble with him. Just as Jin Buchuan turned around, Ba Daojiang, who had received Jin Buchuan's instructions, leaped forward and arrived behind Jin Buchuan. Then he extended his large hand. Jin Buchuan, who was about to walk out, suddenly felt his neck tighten. Then he was sent flying. His body did a 180-degree spin and fell to the ground with a plop. This hit made him see stars. All the bones in his body seemed to have become soft and sore at this moment. Jin Buchuan, who had been smashed into a daze, opened his eyes after about 5 or 6 breaths of time. What he saw was the scene of him kneeling on the ground. Then, he shook his head violently and said, "You, what are you trying to do? Do you know who I am?" No one answered Jin Buchuan's question. Only a few pairs of eyes coldly stared at him. It was as if they were staring at a dying mad dog. Apart from coldness, there was only coldness in their eyes. Jean Buchuan felt his entire body turn cold. He suddenly realized something. Now wasn't the time for him to show off. Instead, it was a problem of whether or not he could protect himself. None of the people in front of him seemed easy to deal with. Just as Jean Buchuan's mind gradually cleared up, the door to the innermost room in the sky room number 1 finally opened. A figure also walked out. As this person's footsteps gradually approached, an indescribable pressure slowly formed, causing Jean Buchuan, who was still half kneeling on the ground, to feel his hair stand on end. The person who had come was tall and his footsteps were steady. There was also a smile on his face that didn't fit the current atmosphere. However, even though there was a smile on his face, Jean Buchuan didn't know why, but when he raised his head and looked at him, he felt suffocated. He had already seen the appearance of the person who had come, so his mouth was wide open at this moment. Duke of Loyalty. Oh, you recognize me. As if he was very surprised that Jean Buchuan was able to recognize him, Yang Qindong's smile grew even wider. However, this sort of smile could be described as the smile of a demon. Reality also proved that after he smiled, Yang Qindong's expression suddenly turned cold. Since you recognize me, you still dare to come and find trouble for me, and even say that you will exterminate my 9 generations? Humph, I really don't know who gave you the guts. Ah! Only now did Jean Buchuan realize how big of a mistake he had made. Although the Duke of Loyalty was feared by the Emperor, he wasn't an existence that would be publicly provoked. He had heard from many of his colleagues that if the Emperor really wanted to deal with the Duke of Loyalty, he wouldn't have allowed him to enter the capital. This was an existence that even the Emperor didn't want to provoke. He had just said that he wanted to exterminate his 9 generations, and so many of his brothers had heard it. At this moment, it seemed like he wouldn't be able to clear his name even if he fell into the Yellow River. When he thought of the severity of the problem and how his godfather would deal with him after he returned, Jean Buchuan's legs that were originally half kneeling suddenly all knelt down. Then, like a pug that was wagging its tail to its master, he crawled forward several steps until he was 2 meters away from Yang Qindong. Duke of Loyalty, it's all this lowly one's fault. I didn't know you were here. You didn't know I was here? Don't you know where this place is? Don't you know what the number 1 heaven room represents? Humph! After mingling in the capital for so long, there's no need for you to deny it. I can see that you're here for me. It's just that you're not strong enough to kill me, so you want to admit your mistake and escape first. But once I let you go, I'm afraid that a large group of embroidered uniform guards will immediately surround this place. You've probably wanted to kill me 100 times before you're satisfied, right? As Yang Qindong spoke, he slowly squatted down and looked at Jean Buchuan as though he was looking at a dead dog. Your scheme didn't succeed, and you're thinking of begging for mercy now. Isn't it a little too late? If anyone who wants to kill me can leave safely, I'm sure that everyone will want to try their luck in the future. Sigh. Although I'm a soft-hearted person, I won't allow others to threaten my safety for no reason. Thus, I can only wrong you a little. Haha, deal with these 2 leaders. I've already said that I'm a soft-hearted person, so I'll only punish the leaders. But if there's anyone else who doesn't have eyes the next time, I'll kill them all. Leave no one alive. These words seem to be an order for Beta Persei and the others, as well as a death sentence for Jean Buchuan. But at the same time, they also seemed to be for the embroidered uniform guards who had been beaten to the ground, their faces swollen and bruised. After saying all this, he didn't even look at Jean Buchuan. He turned around and walked back into the private room. There were still 2 madams waiting for him. Since they were out for a meal, it was best not to let some matters affect their appetite. As Yang Qindong's figure gradually disappeared into the distance, Jean Buchuan's face turned ghastly pale. He finally remembered that the Immortal Abode's number 1 room could only be used by 2 people. One of them was the current emperor. In this regard, Zhu Qizhen of Yingzong would often visit this room. Of course, Zhu Qiu of Daizong also had this right now. The second person was the Immortal Abode's biggest boss, Yang Qindong. This place was originally his property, so he could obviously spend his money wherever he wanted. This was something everyone was familiar with. But just then, Jean Buchuan had completely forgotten about this. He'd rushed in without even looking. This should have been planned ahead of time. Jean Buchuan was still in a daze. While he was still regretting his impudence, the scene in front of him once again drew all of his mental energy over. While he was in a daze, Beta Persei had already lifted Tong Lai up and brought him in front of Jean Buchu and like a dead dog. Second brother, leave this person to me. How about you kill the big one? As if he didn't want Beta Persei to monopolize the limelight, Yang Si chuckled and also walked over. Alright, then we'll each take one. Beta Persei seemed to be someone who readily accepted good advice. He listened to Yang Si's suggestion. He tossed Tong Lai to the ground and reached out his hand to grab Jean Buchuan. In just a moment, Yang Si had already arrived in front of Tong Lai with a sharp dagger. He first smiled, then raised his hand and brought the dagger down. A piece of fresh flesh flew into the air, but to everyone's surprise, only a piece of flesh flew out. There was no blood. Just from this point alone, one could tell that Yang Si was already a qualified butcher. He knew how to do it without drawing blood and still cut off a piece of flesh. This isn't good. You're already starting. Don't act shamelessly. It was as if they were playing a game. Seeing that Yang Si had already taken the lead and swung his dagger, Beta Persei chuckled and also took out a sharp dagger. This scene frightened Jean Buchuan. With Tong Lai as an example, how could he not know what the other party was going to do? Not only was he going to kill, but he was going to torture him to death. This was the method he used to deal with others. In his shock, when he realized that Yang Chundong really dared to kill him, Jean Buchuan was finally terrified. He opened his mouth and shouted, "What are you doing? Do you know who I am? I'm going to..." Swoosh! Blood and flesh flew out. A chunk of fat flew out from under Jean Buchuan's ribs, separated from his body. The one who attacked was Beta Persei. He slashed again and again. As he cut off piece after piece of fat, he did not forget to say, "You don't even F*King know who you are. So how would we know who you are? People with your IQ shouldn't live in this world and waste food." Chapter 799 / Beta Persei and Yang Si seemed to be in a competition. In a short period of time, 108 pieces of flesh fell from Jean Buchuan and Tong Lai's bodies. The pain of this process could not be described with words. The other embroidered uniform guards who were beaten to the ground trembled all over as they watched the flesh of the two lords being sliced in front of them. Then, from the initial fear to the middle stages of struggle and finally to the end, they died with their eyes wide open. One of Jin Ying's godson, one of the embroidered uniform guard by who had just performed a meritorious service, died in front of them. At the beginning he struggled a few times, but in the end he was completely at the mercy of others. All of this fell into the eyes of the 10 embroidered uniform guards who followed them, causing them to close their eyes in fear. Although the Duke of Loyalty had said that only the big ones could be dealt with and the small ones could be spared, who knew if the executors, Beta Persei and Yang Si, would do anything to them in their agitation? If that was the case, they could not resist at all. They were completely fish on the chopping board, at the mercy of others. Just as the 10 brothers of the embroidered uniform guard, with the exception of Chen Guo, were nervous, Yang Si opened his mouth. "Second brother, I haven't had enough yet. Should we take out a few more people to kill? This feels so good." After he finished speaking, Yang Si's cold eyes stared at the 10 embroidered uniform guards. Every time he looked at someone, that person would quickly lower his head, as if he was afraid of being targeted and becoming the next person to be cut off. Fortunately, Beta Persei spoke at this time. "Forget it, young master's orders must be obeyed. As for you wanting to kill people for fun, there should be a chance in the future. There will always be some blind people looking for trouble. When that time comes, you can just kill them all. Who knows, they might even make a move on us in the future." No, they won't. This time, there was no need for anyone to teach them. The 10 embroidered uniform guards answered honestly, shaking their heads as they spoke. They looked like they were about to swear an oath to prove their innocence. They weren't just saying that to save their lives. They were really scared. Who was Jin Buchuan? He was the adopted son of their chief eunuch. However, Yang Chendong killed him just like that. Although he didn't give Jin Buchuan a chance to prove his identity, no one would believe that the loyal duke didn't recognize Jin Buchuan's identity. Thinking about it, Lien Jining's adopted son was killed without any hesitation. There was no room for reconciliation. What were they? He was just an ordinary person wearing the identity of an embroidered uniform guard. Perhaps this could be used to scare some ordinary people and officials, but if he wanted to scare the Duke of Loyal Heart, he could forget about it. None of them wanted to die. The 10 of them shook their heads in unison. Their words fell into Beta Persei's ears. He dug his ears as if he didn't hear them clearly. You don't have to be so loud. I've remembered what you said. Since you are so sensible, when you go back, persuade your other colleagues to try. My fourth brother's knife is very sharp. He can kill without spilling blood. Yes, please rest assured. When we go back, we will be honest people. We will also tell our friends to be good people. We definitely won't dare to cause trouble again. We won't dare. With today's lesson, who would want to be enemies with the Duke of Loyal Heart? Not only that, they would probably advise their friends to not get involved in this mess in the future. Jin Buchuan and Tong Lai were dead, but this matter wasn't over. Just as the 10 embroidered uniform guards were shaking their heads to express their determination, a black armored soldier rushed up from downstairs. He didn't even look at the fallen embroidered uniform guards. His eyes were wide open. Jin Buchuan and Tong Lai's lifeless bodies didn't attract his attention either. He strode up to Beta Persei and whispered, "Big brother Beta Persei, a large group of embroidered uniform guards have arrived downstairs. They've already surrounded this place. Brothers, what should we do?" The newcomer was the captain of the first guard, Chiu Vi. As he spoke, he revealed an expression that suggested he was ready to fight. From the looks of it, he clearly didn't place the embroidered uniform guards outside the immortal abode in his eyes. In reality, the immortal abode was indeed under layers of protection. Not only were there 2 guards in the building ready to counterattack at any time, but they were also there. In the nearby streets, Commander Xiao Feng and the Cold Vanguard warriors were ready to fight at any time. It was true that the immortal abode belonged to Yang Chendong, but it was also located in the capital of Baiming. In a place like this, the slightest carelessness could lead to an irreparable mistake. For this reason, Yang Chendong had naturally made all the necessary arrangements, including a few backup plans. The so-called backup plans were Iron Tiger's Wolf Fang special forces hidden around the palace. As soon as the battle began, they would be prepared to bombard the palace. Although it would be difficult for them to charge into the palace with just a few dozen people, creating a huge commotion wouldn't be a problem. In fact, their goal was to scare the emperor into wetting his pants. Although this was a bit of an exaggeration, Zhu Qiu, who had never seen a real gun before, might really satisfy their demands. It was precisely because he had made all the necessary arrangements that Yang Chendong didn't show any mercy to Jin Buchuan and Tong Lai. One of them had sent an assassin like Shin Kuan to kill him, while the other had dared to disrespect his father-in-law and go to the Hu estate to capture him. The target of killing these 2 people was very obvious. At the same time, it was also a kind of demonstration. It was telling some people that they already knew what they were doing. Didn't they want to see their reaction? Then I'll kill them. What can you do about it? Just from this point alone, it was obvious that he was giving them a taste of their own medicine. As the saying went, it was impolite not to reciprocate. Since you captured Hu Zhongning, let's do the same and kill your men. Let's see who's the first to relent, who's the first to show weakness, and who's the fiercest. Back to Chiu Vi's excited request for battle. Beta Persei waved his hand. The young master said that this is the immortal abode. If we make a move here, the losses will be too great. The young master isn't one to make a loss. So, invite the embroidered uniform guards over and have them clean up the battlefield. That way, we won't dirty our brother's hands with these corpses. Beta Persei spoke very casually, without any intention of suppressing his voice. Everyone present heard him clearly. The 10 embroidered uniform guards naturally looked down, as if they hadn't heard a thing. Dressed in black armor, Shibi's eyes were wide open at this moment, as if she was shocked. The sixth young master had already given him a rough idea of what was going on in the morning. However, he hadn't mentioned whether they would directly kill the embroidered uniform guards or not. Bei had thought that the sixth young master wanted to use this as a warning. He hadn't expected that the embroidered uniform guards would be killed just like that. Not only that, even though he knew that a large number of embroidered uniform guards had already appeared below, Beta Persei was still calm and unhurried, as if he were waiting for the enemy to arrive. What did this mean? He didn't believe that Beta Persei would be so magnanimous. That meant that the sixth young master had already planned for this. He was in the capital of the Great Ming Dynasty, yet he still didn't place the emperor in his eyes. Just this boldness alone was enough to make him unparalleled in the world. At this moment, Bei's admiration for Yang Chendong rose to another level. After Chou Wu received the order, he nodded and left. Not long after, a group of embroidered uniform guards came to the third floor. When they saw the 10 embroidered uniform guards beaten black and blue, as well as the dead Jin Buchuan and Tong Lai, their faces burned with rage. The leader of the group had a dark expression. "You dare to kill embroidered uniform guards in broad daylight. Your guts are truly heaven-defying. Men, arrest all of them." What kind of people were the embroidered uniform guards? They were the lackeys of the emperor. As long as they wanted to, they could charge into the homes of any subject without any evidence. As long as they wanted to, they could arrest the high and mighty court officials as criminals and punish them severely. For example, Wang Ji, the Minister of Appointments, who was known as the Heavenly Official, had also been imprisoned by the embroidered uniform guards, let alone others. Normally, anyone who dared to resist the embroidered uniform guards would be labeled as disgraceful. Killing a member of the embroidered uniform guards was even more disdainful, especially in such a public setting. How was this killing? This was clearly a provocation. The enraged leader of the embroidered uniform guards waved his hand and was about to give the order to arrest the culprits, but a voice soon followed. Why does this voice sound so familiar? I wonder which acquaintance is making a fuss in my immortal abode? How impressive! Impudent! When he heard that someone dared to question the general's orders, an unfathomable embroidered uniform guard shouted loudly. After which, he looked towards the private room in the private room. It was as if he would rush in at any moment as long as the order was given. "Shut your mouth!" The leader of the embroidered uniform guards shouted angrily. Of course, he wasn't rushing into the private room, but rather the subordinate who had just been shouting. With a shout, he stopped his subordinates from shouting. The leader then carefully looked in the direction of the private room and asked very cautiously, "Friend, your voice is a little familiar. Can you come out and meet me?" "Ji Guang, do you think your status is worthy?" A voice came from the private room. It wasn't loud, but it was deafening. At least, that was how the leader of the embroidered uniform guards saw it. The person who had come was none other than the leader of the embroidered uniform guards, Ji Guang. This was the person who had almost had his leg broken by Yang Chendong. Of course, that was a long time ago. Back then, he was still the leader of the embroidered uniform guards, a fourth-rank official. Now, he'd been promoted to a third-rank official. Even though he'd been promoted, he still didn't have the slightest bit of confidence when facing Yang Chendong. On the contrary, that voice was like a nightmare to him. If it had to be said, in addition to revering the current Emperor Zhu Qiyu, he was afraid of Yang Chendong in this world. Chapter 800. He was afraid, because it was precisely this person who had almost taken his life. But after the incident, not only did he have to apologize, he also had to act as if he was completely willing to do so. How was this something an official of the embroidered uniform guard would do? From that moment on, he knew that there were always some people he couldn't afford to offend. Without a doubt, the Duke of Loyalty and Courage was one such person. At first, he felt that the voice in the private room sounded familiar. When he heard the other party call out his name, He knew that he wasn't hallucinating. The other party's identity had been confirmed beyond doubt. Since that was the case, how could he dare show the slightest bit of disrespect? He immediately did something that shocked the other embroidered uniform guards. So it's the Duke of Loyalty and Courage. Ji Guang pays his respects to you. Enough, there's no need for such formalities. Since you know that this Duke is here, go find someone who can keep his word. Otherwise, this Duke will return to the Yang clan manor in 2 hours. If there are any consequences, you all will have to bear them. You may leave. Not only did he refuse to see Ji Guang, but he also wanted to meet someone with more authority. He even set a time limit for the other party. In this world, the only person who could treat the embroidered uniform guards in such a vile manner was probably Yang Qindong. Logically speaking, this was equivalent to humiliating someone. No matter how capable and powerful you were, you still had to show your face, right? Was it really good to be so arrogant? Good, it really was good. At the very least, Ji Guang didn't find anything wrong with it. In fact, after knowing that the Duke of Loyalty and Courage was inside, he even extinguished any thoughts of meeting him. Since their statuses weren't equal, what was the point of meeting him? Was he trying to make things difficult for himself? Duke, please wait for a moment. This humble one will report this matter to the higher-ups. I believe that someone with more authority will come very quickly. Ji Guang was tactful. He clasped his hands and bowed. Then, without daring to look at the corpse on the ground, he turned around and left. Ji Guang came quickly and left even faster. After leaving the immortal abode, he personally rode his horse towards the nearby imperial palace. As he galloped, he almost knocked over a commoner who couldn't dodge in time. However, he didn't slow down at all. Within the imperial palace, Jining was waiting for news from outside. After obtaining Talu City for free, the Daizong Emperor left happily. He became a hands-off shopkeeper and left everything to himself. As Jining received her orders, she also summoned the commander of the brocade guards, Lu Gui. Together, they guarded the palace and waited for news. They didn't have to wait for long before Ji Guang appeared. When he saw the two people in front of him, he knelt on one knee and said, "Eunuch Jin, Commander, things aren't looking good." With a sigh, Ji Guang recounted everything that had happened in the immortal abode. Time was of the essence, and he didn't know much about the situation. He didn't even know why the two sides were in conflict. He was just telling them what he saw objectively. Of course, he couldn't forget Yang Qindong's following request. He had to give an answer within 2 hours or he would leave. Jin Buchuan had actually died, and in the immortal abode at that. Jining was stunned when she heard the news. She immediately stood up from her chair and said with fire in her eyes, "They've gone too far. They've gone too far." Jin Ying's reaction was within Ji Guang's expectations. No matter what, Jin Buchuan was still Jin Ying's adopted son. Even though he hadn't been favored as much recently, and had even been given the cold shoulder, his identity as her adopted son was not fake. Now, not only had he been killed, it had been done in front of everyone. Anyone in this situation would probably be furious. Jining was very angry, but neither Commander LV Gui, who was standing at the side, nor Ji Guang, who was half kneeling there, expressed any opinions on this matter. From this point alone, one could roughly conclude that they would not express any opinions on this matter. Perhaps they were treating this as a family matter, or perhaps they were afraid of the Duke of Loyalty's authority. The two of them didn't say anything. After cursing for a while, Jining slowly closed her mouth. It wasn't easy to put on a one-man show, and she didn't want to lose her composure in front of these people. She forced herself to remain calm and asked Ji Guang, "Tell me, what do you think about this matter? Since you're not going to say anything, I'll force you to. This is one of the privileges of a superior." Ji Guang, who was called out, felt a bit annoyed, but he didn't show it on his face. Instead, he lowered his head again and said, "This kind of important matter is not something a lowly official like me can comment on. That's right, Eunuch Jin, the Duke of Loyalty is still waiting for you in the immortal abode. He said that if he doesn't see anyone willing to talk to him within 2 hours, he'll go to the Yang clan manor." "What? He wants to go back after killing our embroidered uniform guards? He's dreaming. Commander Lu, immediately mobilize the embroidered uniform guards and surround the immortal abode. This isn't the South, nor is it the Plains. I want to see just what kind of ability this Duke of Loyalty has. Jining turned to Lu Gue angrily, asking for his support. The Great Ming Dynasty's political system was made up of three main factions: the imperial power, the scholarly faction, and the eunuch faction. The lowest-ranked eunuch faction had produced Wang Zhen at its peak. He was an existence that stood above tens of thousands of people, second only to the emperor. He was a perfect example of what it meant to be a petty person intoxicated by success. However, ever since the Tumu Castle incident and Wang Zhen's death, the eunuch faction suffered a heavy blow. Zhu Qiyu, who was waiting for the throne, seemed to have learned his lesson and didn't place too much importance on the eunuchs. In comparison, Jining, who was also the head eunuch, was far inferior to Wang Zhen. However, in the past year, the power of the eunuch faction had increased significantly. This was all because the scholarly faction had pushed them too hard. After Zhu Qiyu ascended to the throne, he gave up on the inner court and distributed his power to the 6 ministers, then concentrated it all on himself. However, to become an important official in the court, which one of them wasn't smart. When faced with Zhu Qiyu's methods of dividing power, they quickly began to work together in private. Some small matters were decided by themselves, and they didn't want to trouble the emperor if they could. This was what it meant to have policies from the top and countermeasures from the bottom. No matter what, the 6 ministers were the main representatives of the civil officials. For their own positions and the support of the other officials, they had no choice but to think of ways to divide power from the emperor. In order to keep them in check, although Zhu Qiyu didn't want to, he still used the eunuch faction and began to increase their power in order to achieve a balance that was most beneficial to him. Because of this, Jin Ying's authority had increased a little in the past year. If it were in the past, LV Gue would have agreed immediately when he gave such a clear order. After all, Zhu Qiyu trusted Jin Ying a lot. If he didn't perform well, he would be replaced at any time. Not to mention, he was originally Jin Ying's man as the commander. However, this time he didn't agree immediately. Instead, he shook his head and asked carefully, "Eunuch Jin, this matter involves the Duke of Loyalty and Courage. Shouldn't we ask for the Emperor's permission? If a fight really breaks out and the Emperor questions us, I'm afraid we won't be able to keep our heads." Jin Ying hesitated for a moment. If it was someone else, perhaps he could overstep his authority. As long as it wasn't a big deal, it wouldn't matter even if the Emperor found out. However, the opponent was the Duke of Loyalty and Courage, which was completely different. This was someone who had the ability to compete with the embroidered uniform guards and even the Baiming army. Once this person was involved, a small matter would become a big matter. All right, this eunuch will go ask for the Emperor's permission now. After thinking about it, this matter involved a lot and was far from something he could make a decision on his own. In the end, Jin Ying readily agreed to LV Gue's suggestion. After Jin Ying finished speaking, he prepared to leave. However, at this moment Ji Guang spoke up, "Eunuch Jin, the Duke of Loyalty and Courage only gave us 2 hours. Do you think we should send someone to deal with him first and delay him?" When he thought about the time limit, Jin Ying couldn't help but feel angry. However, when he thought about how Yang Chundong had publicly announced it, and if he really didn't arrive on time, it was hard to say what would happen. He could only sigh and say, "Forget it. Let's have Commander LV go first and delay him for a while." This wasn't a good task, and LV Gue didn't want to go. Just like how Ji Guang didn't want to face Yang Chundong, he had also suffered at his hands before. At the time, Yang Chundong had still been an official in the embroidered uniform guards, and was still his subordinate in name. Not to mention that Yang Chundong had already conquered such a large territory. However, this was Jin Ying's request, and he couldn't refuse. He could only pinch his nose and agree. With LV Gue taking the lead, Ji Guang inwardly sighed in relief. Even if the sky fell, there were tall people to hold it up. He didn't need to worry as much anymore. LV Gue and Ji Guang left the imperial palace, but Commander LV still mobilized several hundred embroidered uniform guards to follow them to the immortal abode. This was clearly done out of a guilty conscience. He was worried that the Duke of Loyalty would try to kill him after seeing him. Since he'd already killed Jin Buchuan, he didn't seem to mind killing him as well. Reality proved that LV Gui's worries were unnecessary. When he brought Ji Guang to the third floor of the immortal abode, Yang Chendong didn't even bother to meet him and just left him there. Clearly, he was reminding him that his status wasn't high enough. LV Gui didn't know whether to be happy or disappointed. However, not having to face the Duke of Loyalty was still a good thing. When Ji Guang said that there would be other important figures coming, they finally received Yang Chendong's permission to stay for a while longer. The two of them relaxed and began to investigate the whole situation. LV Gui arrived, and the 10 embroidered uniform guards who'd been beaten up finally regained their freedom. From their mouths, the two sirs were finally able to get a clear picture of what had happened. However, because they knew the reason, their expressions were bitter. Chapter 801. This Jin Buchuan really deserved to die. Not only did he just have to run right into Yang Chendong's gun, he even said that he wanted to exterminate his entire family. Just based on those words alone, killing them would have been pointless. Thinking about it, if things were that easy, wouldn't the emperor have done it long ago? His Majesty hadn't even said anything, yet you said something like that. What was the meaning of that? Those who didn't know better would think that the emperor had ordered this. Wouldn't the world fall into chaos then? LV Gui and Ji Guang shook their heads. They knew that Jin Buchuan deserved to die. They didn't say anything else. They just waited for Jining to appear. At that moment, Jining was on his way from the imperial palace to the immortal abode. Sitting in the palanquin, he had a displeased expression on his face. When he thought about Zhu Qiu's reaction when he reported the matter to the emperor, he felt even more unconfident. Jining reported everything to Zhu Qiu. Zhu Qiu's face was burning with anger. Just as Jining was wondering if the emperor was going to be ruthless, who would have thought that the emperor would suddenly change his mind? Since the Duke of Zhongdan wants to see an important person, then you should go. With your status, you should be able to speak with him. As for how you want to talk, you can make the decision. In any case, we can't lose the prestige of our Baiming. Face is a must. He was waiting for Jining to take full control of the situation. Zhu Qiu had seen the danger in this matter and decided to stay out of it. If things went well, that was something he should do. After all, this matter had arisen because of his adopted son. If things didn't go well, then sorry, he would very likely be pushed out as a scapegoat. Jining firmly believed in this point. Not only were there many ministers who disliked his position, but there were also many people who were eyeing him in the same group of eunuchs. It could be said that one wrong step could lead to a bottomless abyss. Knowing that he still had to clean up his own mess, Jining walked out of the inner palace with a submissive expression. Then, he hurried in the direction of the immortal abode. Finally, just as Yang Chendong seemed to be getting impatient, he arrived. LV Gui and Ji Guang, who were waiting for him on the other side, breathed a sigh of relief and hurriedly told him all the information they had just found out. Initially, Jining was prepared to enter the private room to meet Yang Chendong. However, when she heard the report from her two subordinates, she stopped. When she heard more and more information, her expression turned ugly. He hadn't expected that this normally quick-witted adopted son of his would be so stupid. His investigation of the Mongolian spies actually led him to the immortal abode, and coincidentally ended up in Yang Chendong's room. What was even more unexpected was that he actually said that he wanted to exterminate the 9 generations of the other party's family. Did he not know what kind of situation it was right now? Hu Zhongning had already been captured and thrown into the imperial prison. This was a crucial moment in the struggle. Any signal released by his every move would be infinitely amplified. If he did not do it well, it might even cause the earth to shake. However, even a smart person would remain silent at this moment. Jining, on the other hand, had taken the initiative to come here and shout about killing. Those in the know would be able to tell that this was a coincidence, but those who didn't would think that all of this had been taught to them by their adopted father. It was no wonder that Yang Chendong had killed him on the spot. This was a matter of protecting one's dignity. If Yang Chendong had ignored all of this and instead backed down, then that would have been a sign of weakness. If that had happened, then he would have really been bullied. Jining finally understood the whole story. She had a lot more plans in her mind. Just from Yang Chendong's behavior, it seemed like he had no intention of starting a fight. Even though he had killed someone, he had no other choice. With this kind of bottom line, Jin Ying's heart was greatly comforted. After obtaining so much useful information, Jining didn't hate Jin Buchuan as much anymore. His death could at least be considered to have helped her, allowing her to get a better understanding of the other party's background. All right, I understand. The price of this kind of probing action is still too high. These words from Jin Ying's mouth were equivalent to defining the situation. In this way, even if Jin Buchuan didn't do anything, he couldn't be considered to have done anything wrong. This would also be beneficial to his relatives who were still alive. What kind of people were LV Gui and Ji Guang? They were people who were used to seeing battles and life and death. With just this one sentence, they had already heard too much useful information. At once they agreed and said, "Yes, yes. Jin Buchuan used his death to test the waters. It can indeed be considered a worthy death." Seeing that her two subordinates understood her meaning, Jining nodded her head in satisfaction. Then, she took large strides and leaped over the bodies of Jin Buchuan and Tong Lai on the ground. She came to the side of the door and said, "Jining has come on the Emperor's orders. Please come to see the Duke of Loyalty." Not long after, Yang Chendong's not very loud voice finally came from inside. "Come in." Following this sound, Jining pushed open the door and entered. Then the inner door closed. Everything was as if it had never been opened. At this moment, only Yang Chendong was left in the inner room. His two wives and personal maids had already entered the inner room to rest temporarily. The treatment of the sky room was similar to the treatment of the president in the future. Yang Chendong sat in front of a small table. There was only a chair in front of him. When he saw Jining, who was no longer young, walk in, he only raised his eyelids and casually pointed at the chair opposite him. "You're here. Please take a seat." The king would not meet the king. This saying had been around for a long time. If they had to meet, it would have to be a time when life and death would be determined. Therefore, Yang Chendong could understand Zhu Qiu. Jin Ying's appearance was something to be expected. Moreover, it seemed that only this person could make decisions on important matters. When faced with this problem, even some important ministers couldn't do it. "Thank you, Duke of Loyalty." As the favorite of the Emperor, Chief Steward Jining was indeed very low-key. At the very least, he was not as arrogant as Wang Zhen had been. Perhaps he also wanted to, but when he knew the identity of the person he was facing, it was best to dispel such thoughts. Jining sat down and exchanged some pleasantries. Then, the two of them chatted like old friends. Although there was a smile on their faces, the words that came out of their mouths had nothing to do with friendship or courtesy. Jining asked, "Why did you come back?" Yang Chendong replied, "The two madams here made me worry, so I had to take them away." "Is that all?" Jining continued to ask, "What else do you think? Or if I had someone else do this, would you have agreed?" Jining asked, "That's not very good, is it? All the important ministers have their families in the capital. You've already taken two madams, so leave these two behind." At this point, Yang Chendong slowly raised his head. A bright light flashed in his eyes as he said in an incomparably firm tone, "This should be my family's matter. Besides, how can those ordinary officials be compared to me? I just took down Talu City and was preparing to give it to His Majesty. Do they have this ability? Or are you saying that you don't want it anymore?" Yang Chendong proposed a condition. He wanted to take his two madams away, and in exchange he would give Talu City as a gift of thanks. But these words caused Jin Ying's face to twist into a nasty grimace. News of Talu City had already been released, and even the emperor had issued a decree telling the officials and common people that Yang Chendong had taken down Talu City on his orders. That place was now Baiming's territory, and the entire country was celebrating. And if something unexpected were to happen, how would the emperor explain it to everyone? More importantly, Everyone believed that this city belonged to Baiming. Now that it was under Yang Qindong's personal possession, what would outsiders think of this matter? Wouldn't this be the same as telling outsiders that the Duke of Loyal and Bold was rebelling? If that really was the case, they would have no choice but to fight. This was how important Talu City was. It had not been this important before, and all of this had just been facilitated. And this news had been released by Yang Qindong. From this, one could see that all of this had been planned long ago. And from this, one could see just how determined he was to take his madams away. It was impossible to change his mind. Jining quickly saw through all of this, but even so, he still wanted to test the waters. After all, once the madams were no longer in Baiming's capital, there would be nothing left to restrain Yang Qindong. This was extremely disadvantageous to them. Thus, he softly asked, "Then what if His Majesty doesn't agree?" Ha ha. In return, Yang Qindong laughed coldly. However, it was this kind of laughter that made Jining feel increasingly uncomfortable in her heart every time it rang out. Fortunately, not long after, Yang Qindong said, "This is truly strange. I want to take my madams away, so this should be a family matter. Do you want to interfere? Of course, if you answer yes, then given my stubborn personality, I really do want to try." As he spoke, Yang Qindong raised his eyes to look at Jining. Then, his fingers suddenly fell on the wooden table between the two of them, and he began to tap rhythmically. Dang, dang, dang. The frequency of his tapping was very slow, but with each tap, Jin Ying's expression turned even more unsightly. At that moment, Yang Qindong seemed unfathomable in front of him. Every finger seemed to serve as a warning. It made Jining feel as if he had been born on the battlefield, as if he had been born in a battle between the Thousand-Blade Army and the Horse Army. This sort of repressed emotion was impossible to stop once it appeared, and Jin Ying's expression grew even more unsightly. As the mental pressure mounted, he finally couldn't help but say something to ease the atmosphere. "The Duke of Loyal and Bold is a pillar of the country. His Majesty is thinking about the safety of your family, isn't he?" Chapter 802. Jining could choose not to say these things. He could even stand up and leave. He believed that Yang Qindong would not stop him. After all, he was just a chief eunuch. Not only would killing him not have any effect, it would also force the emperor to act against him. But in the end, he did not choose to do so. This was because he knew that Baiming already had many enemies. In the south, there was Zhu Qizhen from the Ying sect, and in the north, there was the powerful Walla army. If he were to openly fight with loyalty, his opponent would definitely be happy to see it happen. And even if he defeated Yang Qindong in the end, so what? He would have to sacrifice 800 of his own men to kill 1,000 of his enemies. When that time came, would they be able to stop the unharmed Baiming and Walla? Of course, Jining did not know that if they were to fight, he would be the one to lose. Yang Qindong was known as the god of war. How could he not be prepared to do something that would anger the southern Ming Empire? Putting aside the fact that there was already a regiment led by Xiao Feng in the capital to provide support at any time, with their strong military quality and excellent weapons and equipment, they would be able to hold out for a period of time. If something were to happen here, a telegram would be sent to Tiger's Mane in the first city, and tens of thousands of elite cavalry would descend from Tulu City. They would first attack the Shen Mansion and then take Juyong Pass. At that time, it would not be difficult for them to carry out a coup d'état. This was where Yang Qindong's confidence came from. So-called negotiations might require a certain amount of psychological tactics, but in the end, it still depended on who was stronger. If one did not have enough strength, even if one had a glib tongue, what could they do? They would only be able to delay for a period of time. Yang Qindong was gambling. He was gambling that Zhu Qiyu was a smart person and would not think of starting a war with him first. Just like himself, he didn't want to make an enemy out of Baiming. After all, with the first city, it meant that he had formed a certain amount of power in the Mongolian territory. Once he went to war with Baiming and faced an army of millions, even if he won, it would be a Pyrrhic victory. He might even be attacked by the grassland tribes and even the southern Ming Empire. If that happened, Everything that he had done in the grassland for the past year might go up in smoke. As someone whose dream was to lead the Han people to the top of the world, one could imagine how precious time was. Furthermore, without sufficient military strength and manpower, even if Baiming were to surrender, he would not be able to replan this place. Since that was the case, it was better to put it aside for now. Rather than forcing himself to eat a piece of fatty meat that was much bigger than himself and causing indigestion, it was better not to eat it and continue to recuperate. Baiming's existence could also help him share some of the firepower from southern Ming and Walla. Both sides had the same idea. Neither of them wanted to start a war. This was the condition that the two of them could sit down and talk. Yang Chendong immediately mentioned that he wanted to take his wives away. This was to use his power to suppress others. This was also the basic point of negotiation. If they didn't even have this consensus, there was naturally no need for other people to negotiate. Fortunately, Jining had met Zhu Qiu before coming and guessed what Yang Chendong would say and even what kind of request he would make. The two wives' departure was also within their expectations. In ancient times, the status of women was very low. Even if they left the two wives behind, could they guarantee that they would not join Baiming in a fight when Yang Chendong was powerful? In ancient times, when there were wars, not to mention concubines, even when one's own son was in the hands of the other party, both sides would suddenly start fighting. Was there a lack of such things? Just from this point alone, if Chaoyin and Lady Xiang really thought that they could restrain Yang Chendong, that would be even more ridiculous. In the end, Jining was still so agitated even though she knew all this. In the end, she was just testing him. From the looks of it, the test had been very successful. Yang Chendong's determination to win gave Jining the idea that the other party still had a trump card. As for how the negotiations would proceed from here on out, Jining had even more plans in his mind. If the two wives insist on leaving with the Duke of Loyalty, then what about the Immortal Abode and Outer Heaven Trading Company? Our Baiming is vast and has abundant resources. We can make quite a bit of money here. Jining didn't continue to harp on the matter of the wives. Instead, his gaze fell on these profitable businesses. Ever since Yang Chendong left Baiming in the spring of last year and returned to Jining Manor in the south to pay respects to his ancestors, he'd promised to give Zhu Qiu 20% of the shares in these two businesses. This was something that couldn't be helped. If one wanted to establish a foothold in other people's territory, one couldn't obtain protection without paying a certain price. This was also why Baiming had turned a blind eye to Yang Chendong's strength, even though they knew that Yang Chendong's strength was constantly growing. There were even quite a few pieces of information that proved that the so-called mercenary leader was a fake, and that Yang Chendong really was in charge of everything. This was precisely because of the benefits involved. The current Baiming could already be described as militaristic. For the sake of increasing their military strength, they were constantly training new soldiers and manufacturing new firearms. They even had an artillery battalion. The construction of all these things required money. In addition, the Great Ming dynasty was originally rich in the south and poor in the north. Baiming's establishment had already taken away too much of the benefits. If one really wanted to rely on Baiming's tax revenue to accomplish these things, it would be no different from a fool's dream. However, Zhu Qiu had still managed to do it, and he'd done quite well at that. Wasn't it precisely because of the income these two businesses brought to the imperial court? Not to mention the Immortal Abode, even if business was good, it was impossible for a restaurant to bring in that much income. However, just the Realm Beyond Heaven Trading Company alone brought in over 1 million taels of silver every month. 20% was 200,000 taels of silver. That was more than 3 million taels of silver in a year. This was definitely a number that couldn't be ignored. It was also the source of Zhu Qiu's confidence. The two wives could leave, but the businesses definitely couldn't be let go. Otherwise, if they really started to fight, it would be disastrous. Under Jin Ying's nervous expression, Yang Chendong lightly nodded and said, "The businesses won't be touched. Not only that, but I will also increase the flow of business here. If the mercenaries want to establish themselves in the grasslands, they will need more logistical supplies. After all, New is still a bit too far from the capital. If possible, it would be better to transport goods through the capital. This way, Baiming's monthly income will be much higher. Transporting military supplies from Baiming to the front lines was a good way to quickly strengthen the mercenaries in the beginning city. Logically speaking, Zhu Qiyu and the imperial court of Baiming didn't want to see them become stronger because of this. However, the problem now was that Baiming's military expenditure mainly came from Yang Qindong's business tax. Even if they knew everything, they couldn't refuse. This was an open and above-board scheme. This was like building a highway and wanting to collect tolls. Then, more cars would need to travel on this road. Even if they knew that they would receive more benefits by transporting goods on this road, not only could they not stop them, they even had to warmly welcome them. Yes, I will ask the emperor to make a decision on this matter. Although Jining knew that Zhu Qiyu would definitely agree, she still said this prudently. Don't worry, the emperor will agree. I have already thought about it. In order to express the goodwill of the mercenaries, I will lend Baiming 520,000 taels of silver. You don't have to pay back a single cent for the first 5 years. Starting from the 6th year, you just have to pay it back in 5 years. Yang Qindong's face was full of confidence as he threw out another big bomb. It was said that money could make even the devil turn millstones. This move was the same even for the emperor of Baiming. As expected, when these words were said, Jin Ying's entire body trembled and her eyes lit up. Really? Yes. Yang Qindong nodded happily. Then, he looked at Jin Ying and said, I have shown you my sincerity. I wonder what eunuch Jin will tell me? This meant that they were going to discuss conditions or even make a deal. Jin Ying only hesitated for a moment before immediately replying, Since Duke Zhongdan is so generous, this eunuch will meet with the emperor when I return. I will definitely give Duke Zhongdan an explanation on some matters. Ha ha. Ha ha ha. The two of them seemed to laugh at the same time. They knew that no matter what would happen in the future, at the moment, they had already formed an alliance. Next, the two of them talked in the private room for more than 2 hours. It was only when the sky outside was about to turn dark that Jin Ying stood up and said goodbye. Today's meeting had been to exchange opinions on the general direction of some matters. Next, there would be a professional to discuss this matter. Then, it would be recorded. At that time, it would become a kind of rule that would be enforced. The Imperial Palace. Jin Ying had been gone for nearly 6 hours, and the sky was gradually darkening. The lanterns of the Imperial Palace had already been lit, but there was still no news. As the emperor, Zhu Qiyu paced back and forth in the main hall, an anxious look on his face. His so-called composure had already vanished. Just what is this eunuch Jin trying to do? He couldn't have done anything to Jin Ying, right? Does he really dare to start a war with us in our capital? As countless thoughts ran through his mind, Zhu Qiyu's complexion grew more and more unsightly. The eunuchs serving him all stood far away, afraid that someone would say the wrong thing and incur the emperor's displeasure. Fortunately, there was finally some movement outside the hall. A eunuch hastily rushed into the hall and prostrated himself on the ground. Your Majesty, eunuch Jin has returned. Quickly bring him to see us. Upon hearing that Jin Ying had returned, Zhu Qiyu's expression relaxed. Although he didn't know why he had been gone for so long, there was one thing that he didn't need to worry about. There was no need for him to clash with Yang Qindong in the short term. In contrast to Zhu Qiyu's worry and anxiety, Yang Qindong was natural and unrestrained, steadily walking out of the immortal abode. He then sat down in a large carriage that could defend against arrows and spears, and under the protection of the 1st Black Cavalry, he made his way to the Hu estate. Chapter 803. Since he was going to his father-in-law's residence, he obviously couldn't bring his other wives with him. Xiaoyin and Lady Xiang were both arranged to stay in the immortal abode. Every night, there would be a variety of performances, allowing the two women to enjoy themselves. As for himself, there were still many things he needed to do. Although there had been a murder case in the immortal abode, countless people had seen how courteous Jin Ying was when she left with the embroidered uniform guards. When they learned that the immortal abode was fine even after killing the embroidered uniform guards, The customers who came here felt even more relieved, and the number of customers increased. Tonight, the immortal abode was bound to be incomparably lively. Similarly, the Hu estate was also bustling. Hu Zhangning had already been taken away for 7 or 8 days. Apart from knowing that he was locked up in the imperial prison and hadn't been tortured yet, he didn't know anything else. His own son had been taken away by the embroidered uniform guards and imprisoned. As the father, Hu Xiao appeared calm and composed, but his heart was filled with anxiety. It had only been a few days, but the bustling Hu estate had suddenly calmed down. Not a single official came to pay their respects. This was the reality. Although it wasn't to the point where everyone would kick a man who was down, once the embroidered uniform guards came to an end, there would be many who would take the opportunity to deal with the Hu clan. Hu Xiao had been an official for many years, and had seen all kinds of situations. He was still able to keep his composure. In contrast, his wife, Hu Wangshi, and daughter-in-law, Hu Yushi, who were also Hu Yan's mother and grandmother, couldn't keep their composure. They pestered him every day, asking him all sorts of questions, all about when Hu Zhangning would return. At first, Hu Xiao would respond with a few words, but as time went on, he stopped talking altogether. Instead, he instructed the housekeeper to keep an eye on his 2 wives, telling them to stay in their rooms and not to leave unless absolutely necessary. Although it was quiet now, this was only temporary. As long as Hu Zhangning wasn't released, the matter wasn't over yet. He could become the substitute emperor's target at any time, or even be the one to be executed. Hu Xiao had also thought of counterattacking, but when the embroidered uniform guards appeared and attacked only the Hu clan, everyone else showed an attitude of self-preservation. This made it difficult for him to find an ally. It would be difficult to rely on himself to accomplish anything. This matter also allowed Hu Xiao to see more people's true colors. Although he had been in the government for decades, he had seen many such things. But when it was his turn, he still felt a chill in his heart. However, at that moment, he received news that the Duke of Loyalty had returned to Yang village. In the past, when Yang Chundong returned, Hu Ming would only worry that his grandson-in-law was in danger. But now all he had was hope. After all, he had already returned and could not be chased away. Perhaps his appearance could save his son. In Hu Zhao's expectation, Yang Chundong made his move on the 2nd day after his return. One of the embroidered uniform guards had actually died in the immortal abode. The one who died was the adopted son of the head eunuch, Jin Ying, a Baihu. Coincidentally, that Baihu was the one who had taken Hu Zhangning away from the Hu estate a few days ago. After everything that had happened, Hu Chong couldn't help but feel hopeful. He had a feeling that this time Yang Chundong was building momentum for the Hu clan, and also looking for interest for the Hu clan. Didn't he have the ability to take away his father-in-law? Then he would do something even more ruthless. He would kill him directly in front of so many people. This method was a little extreme, but it was undeniably effective. With this experience, if anyone wanted to harm the Hu clan in the future, they would have to consider Yang Chundong's reaction. They would also have to touch their own necks to see if they were still there. Reporting. When the lanterns were lit and Hu Xiao was about to eat dinner, the steward suddenly reported that the Duke of Loyalty had come to pay a visit. The Duke of Loyalty? A hint of surprise flashed across Hu Zhao's face. Although he knew that after Yang Chundong returned to the capital as his grandson-in-law, he would have to pay a visit to the Hu estate, he hadn't expected it to be so soon. He waved his hand and said, "Please." There was no time to think too much. Hu Xiao got up and looked outside the door. Soon, Yang Chundong's tall figure appeared in his line of sight, and a group of black-armored soldiers appeared with him. Because of the iron armor covering their faces, no one could see their faces clearly, but the powerful murderous aura emanating from their bodies could be felt from far away. This was definitely a group of veterans who had experienced hundreds of battles and killed countless people. Otherwise, they would never exude such a powerful murderous aura. When they could see Hu Xiao from afar, Yang Chundong had Beta Persei and the others stop. "All of you wait here." This was the Hu estate, the residence of the first Madam, Hu Yan. Of course, he wouldn't let his subordinates scare the people here. After giving the order, He hurriedly took a few steps forward with a smile on his face and went straight to Hu Shao, who was standing there. "Ha ha! This old man welcomes the Duke of Loyalty." Seeing that Yang Qindong was so sensible and hurried over to him, Hu Shao revealed a long-lost smile on his face. From this point alone, it could be seen that the other party's attitude towards him was still very respectful. At least, it didn't change because of the change in his status. "Grandfather, you mustn't say that. It's really too much for Qindong." Since he had married Hu Yan, it meant that he had acknowledged everything about her. Now that he saw the first madam's grandfather, he naturally had to greet him as a junior. "Haha! Let's go inside and talk." When Hu Shao heard how Yang Qindong addressed him, his face was filled with joy. He immediately stretched out his hand and pulled Yang Qindong's arm, laughing as they walked into the inner hall. Since Yang Qindong dared to appear in the Hu estate at this time, he must have known what had happened outside, and some of the troubles had even been resolved. This was Hu Zhao's confidence in Yang Qindong. If he hadn't done this, his grandson-in-law would never have rashly visited the Hu estate. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a visit, but a shift in the blame. When all the servants had left, leaving only Yang Qindong and Hu Shao in the inner hall, the old man asked, "I heard that an embroidered uniform guard caused trouble in the immortal abode today, and they were even killed?" Seeing Hu Zhao's questioning gaze, Yang Qindong nodded. There was indeed such a matter. In the end, eunuch Jining also came. The facts also proved that it was all a misunderstanding. With a smile, Yang Qindong recounted everything that had happened that afternoon to Hu Shao. Yang Qindong still respected Hu Shao from the bottom of his heart. This wasn't just because he was Hu Yan's grandfather. It was also because he was one of the leaders of the landowning clans, and because he was a true master of literature. Regardless of whether it was in his previous life or this one, Yang Qindong had always respected scholars. Wasn't the progress of society the result of these scholars' continuous efforts? In addition, Hu Shao had been an official for so many years. He could be said to have lived in the same era as Yang Qindong's late father, Yang Rong. When it came to political wisdom, ordinary people couldn't compare to him. Perhaps he might be able to reap some benefits if he reported this matter to him. Hu Bazwa listened quietly, his expression changing from time to time. When he heard that Yang Qindong wanted to lend 5 million taels of silver to the southern Ming dynasty, as well as that he would use this place as a transit point to transport military supplies to the mercenaries in the grasslands, he was first surprised, then slowly nodded. This move seemed like an act of borrowing, but it was actually a declaration of sovereignty. He wanted to tell the Baiming dynasty that the mercenaries had already established themselves in the grasslands. Once the Baiming dynasty agreed to this request, it would be equivalent to them acknowledging the mercenaries' actions in the grasslands. Although it wasn't completely legal, it was at least reasonable. Both sides didn't say it clearly, but once the matter was approved, the corresponding results would naturally come out. From this point alone, Yang Qindong's 5 million taels of silver was well spent. At the very least, it showed that Yang Qindong's awareness of the overall situation was very strong. How big is this mercenary army now? After listening to Yang Qindong's explanation, Hu Shao thought about it again and finally asked this question. In fact, it wasn't just him. Even the Baiming dynasty, the emperor of the southern Ming dynasty, and the ministers were very concerned about this matter. It was just that the mercenaries' secrecy was too good, so outsiders had no way of knowing. However, there was a saying that everyone agreed on. That was, the mercenaries must have a huge base on the sea. Otherwise, how could these endless mercenaries be explained? How could they explain the firearms and excellent weapons in their hands? After asking this question, Hu Shao stared at Yang Qindong. Facing such a gaze, Yang Qindong only chuckled and then answered, "If this question was asked by someone else, I naturally wouldn't answer. But if grandfather asked this question, I will directly answer it. Your seat is stable." This old man's seat is stable. Hu Shao actually cooperated and said this sentence. Ha ha ha. Yang Qindong, who was laughing loudly, only said one sentence under Hu Zhao's serious expression. "It's enough to destroy northern Ming." What? Even though Hu Shao was mentally prepared, after hearing this answer, His body couldn't help but tremble. He thought that the mercenaries should be very strong. Otherwise, they wouldn't have sent troops to the grasslands after taking down the two small countries, Jiaoji and Lansong. But at that time, whether it was Jiaoji or Lansong, or even the two vast regions of the southern Ming dynasty, they were all considered barren lands. There really weren't any good resources there for people to fight over. For such an unimportant place, if they took it, they would fight. It didn't mean that they had to pay a huge price or have a lot of strength. But now that he heard Yang Qindong's answer, Hu Shao knew that he was too careful and thought that the mercenaries were too weak. They actually had the strength to destroy the northern Ming dynasty. Didn't that mean that they were so powerful that no one dared to imagine it? Chapter 804. The shocked Hu Shao did not think that Yang Qindong would joke about such a thing, especially in such a private setting. If he really was bragging, there was no benefit in doing so. Could it be that he, as a grandfather, would flatter him? Since he could not, the correct answer was to tell the truth. Hu Zhao's face was filled with shock. All of this was within Yang Qindong's expectations. With the strength of the mercenaries, if they only chose Baiming as their enemy, it would not be arrogant to say that they could take them down. It was just that due to various reasons and the conditions were not ripe, he would not do so. However, he still said such a thing to tell Hu Shao one thing, which was the true strength of the mercenaries. With this kind of support, he would not have to be so careful in the future. Of course, Yang Qindong had another thought. He had been away for a long time and could not return to the palace to accompany his wife, Hu Yan. However, if he could move her family over, she would be very happy. Taking this opportunity, he said tentatively, "Grandfather, I won't hide it from you. The mercenaries have a base on the sea. It is very rich and the climate is pleasant. It is a good place to spend your old age. If grandfather agrees, I will immediately arrange for people to send your family there. In the future, you will not have to worry about any dangerous situations." As mentioned before, many people suspected that the mercenaries had a base on the sea. However, that was only a guess without any evidence. However, now that Yang Qindong had taken the initiative to admit it and even invited him, Hu Shao was somewhat moved. This Great Ming was not the same Great Ming. Especially after the separation of the North and South, Hu Shao only felt that his days were not as good as before. The original strategy of ruling the world through literature was changing to ruling the country through military might. Whether it was Baiming or Southern Ming, if they wanted to unify the country, they would inevitably have to fight a big battle. As such, the position of a civil official was not as important. At this time, if Hu Shao chose to leave, it would be the best time. At least he would not have to worry about the pain of war. It was just that this kind of feeling was nothing more than a passing thought in his mind so that it would disappear. Although Hu Shao was almost 70 years old, his body was still very strong. In his own words, he could still work for a few more years. Now that he had agreed to Yang Qindong's request, it was not impossible. However, if he went there, he would only have one identity, Hu Yan's grandfather. If that was the case, it would not be the path he was pursuing. What he wanted was for others to see him in a different light. What he needed was to lay a good foundation for the Hu clan. He was keenly aware of Yang Qindong's great ambition. This person was only in his early 20s, but he had already found such a great foundation. His future could only be described as limitless. Then, as the first madam's maternal family, they should not only eat their fill, but also use this opportunity to do something. Perhaps in the future, the Hu family would have a bright future. All of a sudden, a path was laid out in front of him. Whether it was more vast or ordinary, everything depended on a single thought from him. Thus, Hu Shao quickly made a decision. He would work hard and fight for a better future for the Hu clan's descendants. After making a decision in his heart, Hu Shao looked at Yang Qindong and shook his head gently. Then he asked with a smile, "Duke of Loyalty, you don't think this old man is old, right? Let me tell you, I will work for a few more years. There is no problem at all. Besides, this place will become your army's supply line in the future. You will need someone to help you keep an eye on this place." Hu Shao rejected his suggestion and made the decision to work for the mercenaries. This made Yang Qindong a little surprised. He sighed in his heart that smart people were indeed smart people who knew how to maximize their own interests at the same time. He nodded. Then I will leave it to you, grandfather. Hu Zhao's attitude suddenly changed. Speaking of which, this was not a one-time thing. Ever since the Tumu Rebellion, the Great Ming Dynasty was divided into North and South, and it became harder and harder to be an official. With the decline of the country and the rise of martial arts, Hu Zhao, as the Minister of Rights, lost his former glory. Thinking about how glorious the Great Ming Dynasty was in the past, there were many vassal states. As the Minister of Rights, he had to do countless things every year. But now, other than Korea, who would not send people to Beiming, no other country would put them in their eyes. Not only that, but the situation in the country was not good either. In the past, private schools were everywhere, and there were as many scholars as there were hairs on a cow. But now, the entire country was in an environment of military preparations. Scholars were not as popular as before, and there were not many things for him to worry about as the Minister of Rights. He only had to provide some services for the royal family during festivals. After being the Minister of Rights for so many years, this was something that Hu Zhao had never experienced before. As such, he had long considered resigning. If not for the sake of his child, he didn't know where he should go after resigning. After all, the unrest in the world wasn't just limited to the northern Ming capital. The southern Ming capital wasn't faring well either. If he really did resign, he would probably go into seclusion. But now, he finally had a new goal or perhaps a direction to strive for. That was to help this grandson-in-law of his build a better foundation for the future Hu clan. As if suddenly thinking of something, Hu Zhao looked at Yang Qindong with bright eyes and asked, "When you spoke with Jining, did you talk about your coronation?" "No." Yang Qindong shook his head. In the past, when he was working for the Southern Ming Empire, he had mentioned that he wanted the throne. However, it had been delayed, so he didn't mention it anymore. In any case, it didn't matter to him whether he had the title of prince or not. The mercenaries wouldn't disobey his commands because of this reason. Seeing that Yang Qindong did not seem to care, Hu Zhao earnestly shook his head. No, the title is still very important. At the very least, in terms of righteousness, we cannot lose out. Understanding the meaning behind Hu Zhao's words, Yang Qindong thoughtfully thought for a moment before nodding. Fine. Since that's the case, I'll bring it up again when I negotiate with them, but they probably won't agree. A king with a different surname was a taboo in the Great Ming Dynasty. Besides the founding of the dynasty, no other king with the surname Zhu had been conferred. Of course, the Mu clan was an accident, but in the end, it was because they were too weak and their influence was limited to one area. So what if they were conferred a title? Yang Qindong was different. He was already very powerful, and if he was given a title, it would truly be difficult to control him. It's fine. Whether or not we can agree is one thing, but whether or not we want to is another. At the very least, we have to make our request known. Once the time is right, we will have the foundation and confidence to succeed, Hu Chang said with a thoughtful look on his face. Since he had decided to support this grandson-in-law, he would naturally tell them everything he knew. Okay, I understand. Yang Qindong also nodded very seriously. Hu Zhao was right. Whether the other party agreed or not and whether he made a request or not were two different things. The only thing he needed to fight for now was to lay the foundation for him to obtain the throne openly in the future. While the grandfather and grandson were still chatting, the Hu estate's courtyard was already bustling with noise and excitement. Hu Zhangning had returned, and he had returned safe and sound. However, the Baihu behind him, Gao Shang, was still somewhat weak. Compared to Hu Zhangning's status, Gao Shang's Baihu was nothing. He had suffered a lot in the imperial prison, but he was still a man. He did not speak a word about the Hu clan, which allowed him to return with Hu Zhangning. When his mother, Hu Wangshi, and his wife, Hu Yushi, received the news, they were naturally filled with joy. Hu Zhao was much more reserved. Yang Qindong had just said that he had mentioned Hu Zhangning's matter during the negotiation with Jining. The other party had also agreed to release him quickly. Now, it seemed that their actions were quite nimble. Thinking about it, if they wanted to win Yang Qindong's financial support, If they were slow, it would only cause trouble for both sides. Hu Xiangning's return made the Hu clan very lively. At this time, Yang Qindong left the Hu estate and entered the large sedan. However, few people knew that as soon as he entered, Yang Qindong had already left the sedan on a deserted street. Under the cover of the night, he reported to Yang San, who was waiting at the corner of the street, and rushed straight to a heavily guarded military camp in the west of the city. Yang Qindong had gone in the middle of the night, and he had even concealed himself. Naturally, he was up to something big. In truth, the place he was heading to was an extremely secret place, the Great Ming's artillery camp. During the defense of the capital, Yang Qindong had used his authority at the time to befriend a few Baiming generals. One of them was Yang Guang, the Great Ming general in charge of the artillery camp. After witnessing the power of the mercenaries' cannons, the Baiming imperial court had invested a great deal of manpower and resources into researching firearms. After 2 years of hard work, they had finally succeeded in developing a new type of cannon. As the general directly in charge of the artillery camp, Yang Guang had naturally informed Yang Qindong of this news through a spy in the security bureau. This was also one of the main reasons he had returned to the capital of Baiming. Coming in the middle of the night and in the middle of the day, when he had just killed the embroidered uniform guard and caused a storm in the city, no one had expected him to go through so much trouble. What Yang Qindong wanted to do was to attack everywhere with this thought in mind. Others would think that he would not obediently return to the Yang clan manor and wait for news from the emperor, but he would not. Doing the opposite was the safest way. At the corner of the street, Yang San had already prepared a Baiming soldier's uniform that suited Yang Qindong's figure. Then, Yang San accompanied Yang Qindong to the artillery camp. Chapter 805. Yang Guang, who had received the news early in the morning, was waiting outside the camp. When he saw Yang Qindong, he nodded without any change in his expression. Then, without even looking at Yang Qindong, he turned around and walked into the camp. Artillery General Yang Guang wanted to go back to the camp to check, so he only brought 2 bodyguards with him. Naturally, no one would be blind enough to come and check. Moreover, Yang Guang was very careful. When he knew that Yang Qindong was coming, he had already replaced the guards here with his own people. Naturally, no one would come to check. After entering the artillery camp, Yang Guang turned around and knelt in front of Yang Qindong. He lowered his head and said respectfully, "Yang Guang greets the 6th young master. Get up." Yang Qindong reached out and helped him up. Then, he looked at Yang Guang seriously and smiled. "Not bad. Your body is stronger than before. Very good. It's all thanks to the 6th young master." Yang Guang cupped his hands and said sincerely. This was not a perfunctory remark, nor was it a polite remark. Ever since he became the general of the artillery camp, he had received too much care from Yang Qindong. Not to mention the silver that the security bureau gave him every month, which was enough for him to live a better life, just with the care of the Minister of Justice, Su Yozhen, his position in the army soared. He no longer had to be careful in everything he did and look at other people's faces like before. Could be said that without Yang Qindong's care, he would not be where he was today. Since ancient times, there was a saying that if you take someone's money, you have to do things for them. At this moment, Yang Guang completely regarded himself as Yang Qindong's subordinate. "Okay, we don't have to be so polite before. Bring me to see the cannons." Yang Qindong's time was tight. It was impossible for him to not show up for a long time. He was afraid that it would arouse suspicion. Yang Guang also knew that the Duke of Loyalty was busy with important matters and his time was precious. He nodded and led the way while pointing to the front and said, "There are a few new cannons there that haven't been stored yet. Duke of Loyalty can take a look." In fact, these cannons were supposed to be sent to the warehouse. If Yang Qindong hadn't told his superiors that he wanted to check them carefully for fear of any accidents, he wouldn't have been able to see these things. It was placed in a huge warehouse. Several pitch-black cannons were lying there quietly under red cloth. In the past, the Great Ming Dynasty had a cannon called the copper fire cannon. It was like a large gun barrel, and it was very difficult to move it. Moreover, not only was its power not great, but its shooting range was also very limited. It would only be effective if it was shot at a fixed target in advance. As for using it in battle, it was almost worthless. In view of the various shortcomings in the past, Zhu Qiyu, the emperor of the Northern Ming dynasty, had put in a lot of effort this time. First, he gathered many blacksmiths. Among them, there was no lack of blacksmiths who were experienced in forging firearms. Everyone gathered together to brainstorm and improve the cannon according to the mercenaries' canon. This resulted in the current improved version, which could also be called the enhanced version of the advanced cannon. When the red cloth was lifted by Yang Guang, the biggest change to Yang Chendong was that the cannon had 2 more wheels. Although it still looked very heavy, at least it could be moved, increasing its flexibility to a certain extent. Duke of Loyalty, this cannon is called the Red Coat Cannon by Emperor Daizong. Its bowl diameter is 230 millimeters, its barrel diameter is 80 millimeters, its length is 150 centimeters, and it weighs about 50 kilograms. Compared to the previous copper fire cannon, which had a bowl diameter of 110 millimeters, a barrel diameter of 58 millimeters, a length of 36.5 centimeters, and a weight of 15.75 kilograms, it is more powerful and its shooting range is more than twice as long. After listening to Yang Guang's introduction, Yang Chendong looked at the cannons. There was an opening at the front of the barrel that was larger than the barrel. The back of the barrel was a powder chamber and there was an ignition hole for the fuse. Yang Chendong nodded. It looks much more impressive than the previous cannons. However, I wonder how far it can shoot and how lethal it is. Duke of Loyalty, we have tested this several times. The conclusion is that once the cannon is fired, its attack range can reach up to 450 meters, and its killing range can reach up to 3 meters. Attack range is still a shortcoming. Yang Chendong shook his head when he heard that the cannon could only hit less than 300 meters away. If someone else had said this, Yang Chendong would have retorted, saying that the other party was sour grapes. However, when the same words came out of Yang Chendong's mouth, it was completely different. Yang Guang had once followed Yang Chendong and was fortunate enough to see the mercenaries' cannon. He understood what Yang Chendong meant. That's right, Duke of Loyalty. However, to be able to hit a target at a distance of 450 meters is already very difficult. To be honest, Baiming doesn't have much money. Even the 500 cannons used up their entire treasury. About an hour later, Yang Chendong and Yang San followed Yang Guang out of the artillery battalion with their disguises as bodyguards. This trip had given Yang Chendong a deeper understanding of the Baiming army's capabilities. To be honest, he was still somewhat shocked. It was also because of his appearance that the development of Baiming's cannons had improved significantly. According to Yang Guang, other than the fact that the attack range wasn't satisfactory, the effectiveness of the cannons were many times better than before. If these cannons were used on the battlefield, the mercenaries would suffer greatly if they didn't know about it beforehand. After bidding farewell to Yang Guang, the two of them made their way to the Su clan in the capital. Since they were already out, Yang Chendong naturally had to do what he had to do. The carriage representing him should have already picked up the two madams and left the immortal abode for the Yang clan manor. That was tantamount to attracting everyone's attention. At this time, Yang Chendong's actions would remain a secret. Young master, how about I bring a few more people with me? There's no need to alarm others. Our Bureau of Security has a team in Baiming. Although they aren't as strong as the guards, they're still quite skilled. When Yang San learned that Yang Chendong was going to visit Minister of Justice Su Yozhen's residence, and that it was a secret visit, he couldn't help but worry for his safety. It's fine. Yang Chendong smiled and refused his kind intentions. Since they were going in secret, the fewer people who knew about it, the better. As for whether or not there would be any danger with just the two of them in the Su clan manor, haha, even if Su Yozhen was given a few more guts, he still wouldn't have the guts. In the Su clan manor, it was already late at night, but as the master of the manor, Su Yozhen had no intention of going to sleep. Even though his new concubine had already sent people to urge him several times, he still remained indifferent. Through his own channels, Su Yozhen had already learned about what had happened in the immortal abode today. This was the main reason why he couldn't sleep peacefully. Speaking of which, Su Yozhen could be considered one of the first officials to pledge allegiance to Yang Chendong, and he'd also benefited the most. He'd been promoted from a mere 6th-rank official to the Minister of Justice, a 2nd-rank official. After Dai Zong removed the cabinet, the position of Minister of Justice was equivalent to that of a cabinet elder, and he was one of the highest-ranking officials. Logically speaking, after reaching his current position, there shouldn't be anything to be dissatisfied with. However, in reality, Su Yozhen's heart had always been in his throat. It had been a long time since he'd had a good night's sleep. The reason for all this was because Yang Chendong was too powerful. It had to be said that Su Yozhen's thirst for power and wealth was extremely great. In fact, he'd even resorted to some shady and unscrupulous methods to get to the top. However, all of this was for the sake of a better life. He'd never even considered rebelling. For example, when he'd first chosen to follow Yang Chendong, it was because he saw how generous this young master was and wanted to take advantage of him. He'd never imagined that not only was Yang Chendong generous, but his methods of handling matters, especially when it came to war, were so formidable that he'd become a threat to the existence of the great Ming dynasty. Su Yozhen had never thought that things would turn out this way. He just wanted to lean on a big tree to enjoy the shade. After all, if he wanted to be an official in the imperial court, he must learn to unite with others and stand in a group to attack another group. In layman's terms, it was a struggle between parties for authority. However, the big tree he was relying on was too powerful. It directly skipped this step and went straight to a new force. If it wasn't restrained, it wasn't impossible for it to become a new country one day. As a result, it was too dangerous for Su Yozhen to stand under this big tree. If he didn't want to be an official, he could resign and return to his hometown. However, if he relied on other forces and was found out, he'd definitely lose his head. Not only him, but even his family wouldn't be able to get any benefits. At that time, it was entirely possible for his entire family to be executed, with such a serious consequence pressing down on his head. He was afraid that no one would be able to sleep peacefully. Fortunately, Yang Chendong didn't appear in front of him often. As the saying goes, the mountain is high and the emperor is far away. What the eye doesn't see, the heart doesn't worry. When he didn't think about things, his mood would be better. However, now that Yang Chendong had returned to the capital of Baiming, wouldn't their relationship be discovered at any time? For the sake of the overall situation, the Daizong emperor wouldn't do anything to Yang Chendong. But that didn't mean that he couldn't deal with him. Duke of Loyalty, how could you be so bold? You even killed the embroidered uniform guards and caused such a big commotion. Aren't you forcing the Daizong emperor to fall out with you? Imperial power can't be blasphemed. If that's the case, both sides will really fight. What should we do? Su Yozhen muttered to himself with an ashen expression. He didn't know the true strength of the mercenaries. Only habit told him that the Great Ming Dynasty was the Great Ming Dynasty. Not everyone could succeed in a rebellion. Over the years, hadn't countless facts already proven this point? Chapter 806. Once he thought about how Yang Chendong would be destroyed by Baiming, he would not be able to gain any benefits and would not be far from the destruction of his family. Su Yozhen sighed in his heart. He even considered whether he should take the initiative to confess to the emperor and tell the truth about his relationship with Yang Chendong. However, this was just a thought. When he thought about the serious consequences of doing so, he shook his head and gave up. He understood Zhu Qiu. It was true that he wanted to do things, but he was not very broad-minded. Once he found out about his relationship with Yang Chendong, he would not even have the chance to explain before being beheaded. Thinking of the possible consequences, Su Yozhen couldn't eat or sleep. Just as he was feeling dejected and did not know what to do, light footsteps suddenly came from outside the inner courtyard. Su Yozhen was the dignified Minister of Justice and was in charge of Baiming's law enforcement. His status was extremely noble, and he was the most important person in his residence. If he did not summon him, no one would be able to approach his small courtyard without permission. When he heard the sound, he could not help but raise his head to look. Then, he asked with a cold expression, "Who is it?" Without my order, who allowed you to come here? He was angry and had no place to vent it. It was as if he had suddenly found a good place to vent his anger. At the same time, a trace of ruthlessness flashed through his eyes. To be able to become the minister of justice, his temperament had long changed. It was not a joke to show his power without anger. If it was someone timid, they would have trembled from head to toe upon hearing this voice. However, this time, the person walking over acted as if he did not hear him. His footsteps were unusually steady, as if he had returned to his own home. There was actually someone in the residence who did not know when to stop. Su Yozhen's expression became even uglier. He even thought about whether or not he should call the head butler over and teach him a lesson. However, when the figure came closer and he could see clearly, the reprimanding words that were about to come out of his mouth stopped. Perhaps it was because the anger he was holding was too unbearable, but it made him feel as if his face was flushed red. Duke of loyalty and courage, how could it be you? Why can't it be me? Your place is a tiger's den. Can't anyone come in? Looking at Su Yozhen's surprised expression, Yang Qindong's expression was still very calm. Then, he ignored Su Yozhen's surprise and walked into the house. He found a chair and sat down. Because Su Yozhen had something on her mind, she walked out of her room to get some fresh air. Now that she saw Yang Qindong return to his room, she felt cold all over. Thinking that it was winter now, she quickly trotted over. He didn't know that his current performance was no different from that of a lackey. Yang Qindong acted as if he had returned to his own home. He found a chair near the stove and sat down. Then he saw Su Yozhen trotting over. Perhaps it was because his living conditions had improved. Compared to the last time they met, he had gained at least 5 kilograms. He was not thin to begin with, but now he looked even more plump. Minister Su, look at your figure. You eat and drink well. Ha ha, it's all thanks to Duke of loyalty and courage. In this short period of time, Su Yozhen had stabilized her mind. When she spoke, she was much more energetic. Good, it's good that you know. Yang Qindong nodded and then smiled as if he was joking. I have been worried that Minister Su would be worried because you are too close to me in private. Now, it seems that there is no need to enlighten you. It seemed to be a joke, but Su Yozhen was not stupid enough to take it as a joke. His thoughts were seen through. An awkward expression flashed across his face. Then, he flattered, Duke of loyalty and courage, you are really extraordinary. I heard that you killed the brocade guards. It was really good, really good. Jean Buchuan actually dared to have thoughts of harming the Duke of loyalty and courage. That Tong Lai actually dared to make a move against Hu Zhen. There was more than one smart person. Obviously, Su Yozhen also saw that Yang Qindong killed people today not only to establish his prestige, but also to settle old and new debts. Just based on this point, this person was worthy of being a minister. He really had some skills. Yang Qindong naturally did not have the intention to hide it from the other party. In fact, after knowing that Hu Kuan was under Jean Buchuan's orders, the Security Bureau told Su Yozhen the news and asked him to cooperate to get some information about Jean Buchuan. He could be considered an insider. It was not surprising that he could say such words. Yang Qindong also nodded. Come, have a seat. Tell me about your views on the current situation. Yang Qindong was never arrogant and did not think that the decisions he made were necessarily correct. What he needed to do was to listen to more people's opinions and then choose the most suitable path for himself. This time, other than coming to Su Yozhen to remind him, he also wanted to listen to the views of this bystander on the current situation and use it as a reference. The Security Bureau had already reported that Su Yozhen's recent performance was not very good. There were many things that he did not take the initiative to report to them, giving them the feeling of being thousands of miles away from them. When Yang Qindong reported the matter to him, Yang Qindong had already guessed Su Yozhen's thoughts. After all, scholars were scholars, and their courage was still a bit too small. They dared to do things like fighting for power and profit, but when it involved rebellion and the lives of their entire family, they still retreated in the end. It was just that, after receiving so many benefits and taking so much money from him, he wanted to withdraw now? How could there be such a cheap thing in the world? He was mainly here to remind the other party that there were some things that could not be turned back, such as political choices. Before getting down to business, Yang Qindong did not mind listening to his views on the current situation. So he sat down with a calm and composed look. Su Yozhen was a smart person, even very smart. Yang Qindong suddenly came to visit at night, and he did not even greet him. Why was that? Wasn't it a sign that he did not believe him? Thinking that the other party was able to quietly appear here, presumably, the servants in the residence must not have noticed. While he cursed them in his heart, he also became extremely careful. This was a person who could even kill the embroidered uniform guards if he wanted to, and he did it openly. If he angered the other party, it would not be too much trouble for him to kill him. While he was frightened, Su Yozhen knew that he had to perform better to obtain Yang Qindong's attention and trust. At that moment, he was silent for a while, then he began to speak quietly. The current emperor is a very thoughtful and ambitious person. As a descendant of the Zhou family, he wants to repeat the glory of his father's generation. Unifying the great Ming dynasty is one of the things that he wants to do, and then he wants to eliminate the external enemies and sweep the world. In order to achieve this goal, the Baiming army imitated the mercenaries and greatly improved their weapons and equipment. Now, advanced firearms and even advanced cannons have been created. The 500,000 recruits have been trained, and the 500,000 newly recruited soldiers are also in the midst of training. If this continues, it will not be long before the conditions for war are met. At that time, not only the southern Ming dynasty and Walla, but even the mercenaries will be enemies in their eyes. As he spoke, he paid attention to the changes in Yang Qindong's expression. This was the reason why Su Yozhen wanted to retreat and get off the boat. Didn't the mercenaries rely on their advanced firearms to win against the Walla? Now that the Baiming army has a large number of firearms, and they have more people than the mercenaries, their advantage is obvious. If the two sides were to meet, who would win and who would lose would be a big question mark. If that was the case, where would Su Yozhen go? Yang Qindong naturally understood the situation. He was originally a little worried, but after going to the artillery battalion, his worries completely disappeared. Even if the cannons could only hit a distance of 500 meters, what did he have to fear even if they were stronger? Not to mention other things, with his large warehouse, he could completely destroy the artillery battalion in an instant. However, he would not say these words to Su Yozhen. Although this person had joined him long ago, it was only because of the situation. In his heart, this person was still biased towards the Ming dynasty. In his eyes, only the Zhou family was orthodox. Even if he was only a prince with the surname Zhou, perhaps he would still follow him. On the contrary, in the eyes of others, a power with a different surname would not have a good ending sooner or later. Su Yozhen was not the only one who thought this way. In fact, there were many people who thought this way. They all saw the Zhou family's descendants as orthodox. This was also another reason why Yang Qindong did not choose to start with the Ming dynasty. He did not want to spend a lot of effort to manage them after occupying a piece of land, or even prevent them from rebelling. On the contrary, small countries like Jiaoji and Lancang did not have a deep foundation. If they fell, then so be it. They would be able to be used very quickly. Speaking of which, Su Yozhen's words also indirectly expressed his attitude. That was, the Baiming army had become stronger. This meant that sooner or later the mercenaries would have to fight with them. Moreover, many people did not think highly of the mercenaries. This was the current situation in Baiming. Su Yozhen was still sitting there talking. He talked about the changes in the army, the changes in the imperial court, and especially the changes in the Ministry of War. Recently, the generals had been making adjustments. It was unknown how many young men who had no background but were capable were promoted to the front lines. All of this proved that Zhu Qiu valued the military very much and that he was determined to fight. As expected of someone who had been a cabinet minister in the future, and as expected of one of the most powerful ministers in history, Su Yozhen's analysis of the situation was clear and logical. The information that came out of his mouth was much richer and more vivid than the information obtained from the Security Bureau. Chapter 807. Su Yozhen spoke for quite a while. After drinking 2 cups of tea, she ended her speech with one sentence. I even have a suspicion that the Southern Ming and Northern Ming might even cooperate for the sake of the Zhou clan's empire. If they really do come to an agreement and work together to deal with foreign powers, then no power in the world would be a match for them. When he said this, Su Yozhen's attitude was firm, as if what he said was the truth. However, he didn't know that the world he was talking about and the world Yang Chundong was talking about were worlds apart. Putting everything else aside, what he saw was only the great Ming Empire. It also included the surrounding small countries, Korea, Japan, Mongolia, and other places. He couldn't imagine how big the world was outside of Asia, how many countries there were, and how strong or weak they were. But Yang Chundong knew, and his goal was grand. He didn't just want to conquer the great Ming dynasty, nor did he want to repeat the glory of the Mongols. He also wanted to achieve an even higher goal, and that was to unify the whole world, and let all the Han people stand at the peak of the world. If he had to describe it in one sentence, it would be that as long as he could see the world, it would become the territory of the Han people, and it would be under the rule of the Han people. This was a great dream that no one in the past or in the future would be able to achieve. Even if Yang Chundong came from the future and had advanced technology, it would still be very difficult to achieve this goal. After all, this didn't only involve military affairs but also religion, faith, culture, geography, and so on. However, Yang Chundong still did it without hesitation. With his current strength, he could be a rich man, or even a carefree prince. He could occupy his own land, establish his own country, and unify his own territory, ensuring that he could live a good life. However, he didn't make such a choice. He thought about how the world treated the Han people in the future, and how the Han people couldn't obtain true fairness in many things. Since he came here, he had to think of a way to change everything. Perhaps thousands of years later, he wouldn't be here anymore, and his descendants wouldn't be able to live up to expectations. In the end, the world would change again. However, he wouldn't refuse to do what he should do, and he wouldn't stop doing it because of the law of development. There were always people who had to do things. If the Han people wanted to achieve these goals, who knew how many people they would have to kill in the end, and how many countries would have to be destroyed? But so what? Buddha said, if I don't go to hell, who will go to hell? If there was any punishment from the heavens, then it would be directed at him. As long as the Han people could live a better life and have a higher status, it would be worth it for him to sacrifice himself to help all the Han people. After Su Yozhen finished speaking, he talked about how powerful Baiming's military was now. Subconsciously, he was also advising Yang Chundong to stop. He even revealed his own thoughts in his words. If Yang Chundong was willing to stop his expansion and hand over all the mercenaries to the court, he would be willing to protect him and let him live a carefree life as a prince with a different surname. Chuckling, Yang Chundong looked at Su Yozhen with a cold gaze. As the saying goes, a person in Jianghu is like a boat going against the current. If you don't advance, you will fall back. The situation was already like this, so how could he possibly retreat? Even if he handed over his military power and obtained the identity of a prince, who could guarantee that once the great Ming dynasty gained the upper hand, there wouldn't be a day when they would kill the donkey after it had outlived its usefulness? Would there be a day when they would casually find a reason to kill him? Yang Chundong didn't like the idea of putting his life in the hands of others. As the saying goes, one's life is up to oneself and not the heavens. Since he already had this ability, why should he put his hopes on others? Chuckling, Yang Chundong looked coldly at Su Yozhen. Minister Su, I already know what you said. I also appreciate your good intentions, but you are not me, so you can't make decisions for me. Similarly, I am not you, so I can't make decisions for you. But I can still give you a suggestion. Oh, loyal Duke, please say it clearly? Su Yozhen looked like he was all ears. Actually, it's not much of a suggestion. It's just the truth. After I leave, you can go into the palace to see Daizong. Tell him everything about your relationship with him, including how much you've received and what you've done for him. You can tell him everything. You can even tell him that Baiming won't allow other forces to exist. Loyal Duke also won't allow other forces, including Baiming, to exist. The best way to solve this problem is to take advantage of the fact that my army is outside and people are in Yongjia village to immediately attack me. This is the best way to solve this problem once and for all. There was a smile on his face, but every time he said a sentence, Su Yozhen's body couldn't help but tremble. How was this a suggestion? It was clearly a threat. Su Yozhen had done a lot of research on Daizong. If you really had a problem with government affairs, he could forgive you. If you were just greedy and had a good performance, he would only remind you. He wouldn't really do anything to you. After all, the great Ming dynasty didn't kill imperial censors and didn't punish scholars. The ancestral law still had some effect. However, if you dared to live off one person and betray another, then it was absolutely intolerable. The previous Minister of Justice, Yu Shuriwe, was someone that Daizong had personally favored and promoted. In terms of closeness, he was much stronger than him. But in the end, what happened? Was it because Yu Shuriwe was found to have private contact with Southern Ming Ingzong and was immediately executed? Yu Shuriwe said that Kill had been killed, so why should Su Yozhen be fine? Did he really think that everything would be fine if he took the initiative to admit his mistake? Too naive. Su Yozhen, who was already covered in cold sweat, was no longer as confident as when he analyzed the situation of the world. He continuously wiped the sweat with his sleeve and looked at Yang Qindong. He forced a smile and said, "Loyal Duke, I'm joking." "Humph, this is indeed a joke. I also hope that you won't give me the chance. Otherwise, I don't know if I'll be fine, but you will be the first to die. If that day comes, even if Daizong wants a good reputation and let your family go, I won't let them go. Don't blame me for being ruthless. Being merciful to one's opponent is being cruel to oneself. I will definitely not do such a stupid thing like letting a tiger return to the mountain. That's all I have to say. You should think carefully about what to do in the future and what to do." After saying this, Yang Qindong stood up. He didn't look at Su Yozhen and didn't listen to any of his explanations. He turned around and walked out of the room. At this moment, he needed to give Su Yozhen time to think carefully. In a hurry, even if the other party made a choice, it might not be sincere. Yang Qindong had already left. Su Yozhen felt his body go soft and leaned against the chair and collapsed into a ball. No matter how regretful he was now, and no matter how much he didn't think highly of Yang Qindong, he had no choice now. It wasn't an exaggeration to say that he had already boarded Yang Qindong's ship. Now, even if he wanted to get off, he had to. He seemed to have no other choice. It had been 7 or 8 days since Yang Qindong returned to the capital of Baiming. Seeing that the new year was coming in 3 days, the atmosphere of the entire Yang family manor became lively. Ever since he entered the capital on the 2nd day, Yang Qindong had been holed up in the manor and hadn't gone out. Firstly, he didn't want to add any pressure to the guards around him. Secondly, he didn't want to excessively provoke the Baiming court. Jining had already sent someone to pass on the message. Daizong had agreed to most of the requests that they had discussed, but there were some specific details that still needed to be discussed. From today onwards, Jining would personally come to the Yang family manor to talk and make the final decision on some matters. Beta Persei, I'll leave this matter to you. In the morning, Yang Qindong practiced martial arts and ran 5 kilometers with the guards. When he returned to the courtyard, he said this to Beta Persei. "Me?" Beta Persei pointed at himself in disbelief. "Yes, it's you. I think it's good that you're dealing with Jining. Of course, I'll arrange 3 assistants for you. Yang San, Wang Si, and Shibei will follow you. You just need to be in the formation and watch the 3 of them perform. When the discussion is over, you'll be in charge of the final decision." Yang Qindong said this very solemnly. He didn't seem to be joking at all. Yang Qindong didn't have a good impression of eunuchs. He was even more repulsed by this kind of debating with them. If it weren't for the fact that the time was far from ripe, he probably wouldn't have even bothered to talk and would have directly mobilized his troops to fight. Since he couldn't fight, he would leave the negotiation to his subordinates. There was also an advantage to leaving it to Beta Persei. If something fell through, he could step in at the end to remedy the situation. After Yang Qindong said this, Beta Persei knew that the matter had been decided and couldn't be changed. He nodded and said, "All right, Beta Persei will obey the young master's orders." "Haha, very good." He reached out and patted Beta Persei's shoulder. "All right, you go and discuss with Yang-san and the others. I'll go to the academy to take a look at the young master." Yang Chendong didn't bring any guards. This was a sign of his confidence in the safety of the Yang clan. He strode to the outside of the academy. Along the way, many people would salute him from afar when they saw him, expressing the most sincere respect in their hearts. Chapter 808. In the past few days, Yang Chendong came to the academy most often, except for the bed of the two madams in the inner courtyard of the manor. In line with the political policy of putting people first and needing talents for development, he even gave a few lectures to the students of the academy. The contents of the lectures were not from the textbooks, but they were very practical and involved some profound issues such as local management and human rights, which attracted the reflection and discussion of the students of the academy. According to the second Dean Wang Si, the discussion was very enthusiastic, and the results were obviously good. The new year was coming soon, and the negotiations were about to begin. Everything was developing in an orderly manner as expected. Yang Chendong was in a good mood, humming some tunes of the later generations as he came to the gate of the academy. Coincidentally, he bumped into Junko, who was dressed in Han Chinese clothing, but it still set off her slim figure. Junko was at the age of 18 or 19, which was the most beautiful time of her life. Suddenly, she saw Yang Chendong here, and the other party was alone. This scene and this sudden encounter made her stunned in place, and then quickly lowered her head. Yang Chendong was also a little surprised by this unexpected encounter. But since they met, it was not good to not say anything. So Yang Chendong tried to pretend to be normal and said, "It's Junko? How are you? How are your studies here? You should be used to life here." 2 years ago, the two of them were still in contact with each other. At that time, the relationship between the two of them was much warmer than it was now. There was even a time when the two of them almost had a spark of love. But with the passage of time, her feelings for Yang Chendong slowly decreased. At this moment, Junko didn't know how to face Yang Chendong. She didn't even know what to say to him. Seeing Junko standing there for a long time without speaking, Yang Chendong's expression was slightly embarrassed, and then he said, "Oh, you still have things to do? Then you can do it." After saying this, Yang Chendong was about to walk past Junko. But just as he took a step, Junko, who was lowering her head, suddenly said, "What? You don't want to see me? You're not even willing to spend some time alone with me?" Yang Chendong looked aggrieved. "I was talking to you and I even acted like I cared about you, but you didn't answer me at all." Of course, such words could only be suppressed in his heart. Yang Chendong wasn't that stupid to reason with a woman. He chuckled, looking very calm. "How could that be? After all, we're old friends." "Oh, right, do you have any plans for the future?" "After the new year, I will take the people in the manor and leave for the grasslands. If you are willing, you can come with me. Of course, if you miss your royal father, I will arrange for someone to send you to your own country after we reach the grasslands." How should he treat Junko? This was a problem that the two ladies often talked about with him these days. Junko was young and beautiful. She grew up in the palace. She had a noble and elegant temperament, the kind that men couldn't help but like. Yang Chendong was a man, a very normal man and a healthy man. If he said that he didn't have any thoughts about her, he wouldn't believe it. But when he thought that one of his goals in the future was to destroy the Japanese army and rebuild it, he had to suppress his thoughts about Junko. Not only did he want to marry her, but he also wanted to destroy her country, especially the country that belonged to her royal father. No matter how he looked at it, it was so unreasonable. Yang Chendong was a person who cared about his face. He couldn't do such a thing. After thinking about it, Yang Chendong made the decision to let go of Junko. Of course, this decision was made by himself. If Junko didn't want to leave him and insisted on following him, then he would stop while he was ahead. The choice he was making was a test for him. Yang Chendong actually said that he would let her go. This was what Junko had been thinking, but she didn't know why. Now, after hearing this sentence, she was not happy at all. There was a faint sense of loss in her heart. That, I will give you an answer after thinking about it. Okay? Anyway, no matter what, I will go to the grassland with you, right? Junko didn't make a decision right away. Instead, she decided to use this time to think about it. She had to admit that Yang Qindong's shadow had long been in her heart. If she was just an ordinary Japanese woman, she was afraid that she would have already found a way to throw herself into the arms of this man who gave her the feeling that he was omnipotent and had the most solid arm. But she was not. She was the daughter of the Emperor of Japan. She was destined to dedicate her life to the country and her family. This mission was instilled in her heart since she was a child. It was not something that could be changed in 2 years. Yang Qindong didn't expect her to answer right away. This was something that would decide her life. So he nodded painfully. Okay, after you reach the grassland, you can come to me after you have made your decision. No matter what decision you make, I will understand and support it. Thank you, Junko said gratefully when she heard Yang Qindong understand her so well. You're welcome. Yang Qindong, who answered with a smile, suddenly remembered that the negotiation with Jining was still lacking a recorder. He remembered that Junko's Chinese was not only good, but her handwriting was also very beautiful. So he had another idea. By the way, the negotiation between the Beiming Imperial Court and us will begin soon. If you are interested, you can be a recorder. Recorder. Junko raised her head and looked at Yang Qindong with those big eyes that seemed to be able to speak. Yes, a recorder. You will record what both sides have said, as well as the final result of the negotiation. It is actually a bit difficult. If you are not willing to go, I will arrange for someone else to do it. Yang Qindong didn't know what Junko meant, so he didn't say anything. No, I am willing to go. To Yang Qindong's surprise, Junko actually nodded excitedly. As the emperor's daughter, she seemed to be very interested in politics since she was young. Now that she was lucky enough to witness the negotiation between Beiming and the mercenaries, she naturally wouldn't reject such a good thing. Okay, then you should prepare well. Yang Qindong nodded. He also had his own plans in mind. He wanted Junko to understand more about the situation on his side. Perhaps after a comparison, she would discover how weak the Japanese Empire was and directly throw herself into his arms. After this meeting, Jining quickly brought a group of people to the Yang village. A large house was specially arranged in the outer courtyard. The fire inside was very strong, and it became the place for both sides to negotiate. Beta Persei appeared as the main negotiator. Along with him were the chief of security, Yang San, the second dean of the Yang Academy, Wang Si, Yang Qindong's personally appointed advisor, Shib, and the recorder, Princess Junko. Jining didn't show any displeasure towards Yang Qindong not personally participating in this negotiation. On the contrary, he was somewhat happy. After all, Yang Qindong gave him too much pressure. Anyone who faced such a strong opponent would bear a heavy psychological pressure. Under such a mentality, it was very difficult to negotiate a favorable outcome. Yang Er, on the other hand, was different. He would not give himself any pressure. This way, when they were talking, he would be able to express his own demands better, and even raise some excessive conditions. Both sides sat together with their own thoughts and began to negotiate some related matters. 15 li away, in the capital of Beiming, in an extremely ordinary courtyard, several people were gathered to discuss a heaven-shaking matter. It wasn't an exaggeration to call it a major matter, because the ultimate goal of this matter was to kill the Duke of Loyalty, Yang Qindong. When Yang Qindong arrived in the capital of Beiming, the ones who were nervous were naturally the Beiming faction. First, they had to make a choice between attacking or not attacking, and once they chose to cooperate, no one would harbor any evil intentions toward the Duke of Loyalty. But just because Beiming didn't have such thoughts didn't mean that others didn't, like the Southern Ming Empire. The people in this room were assassins sent by the Southern Ming Empire. They had made the decision to assassinate Yang Qindong with the dual goal of striking down the mercenaries and Beiming. And once their goal was achieved, it was easy to imagine what kind of chaos it would cause. At that time, Both sides would fight to the death, and no matter who won or lost, the Southern Ming Empire would be able to reap the benefits. When the Southern Ming Emperor Zhu Qizhen made this decision, he gave the task to his most trusted aide, Chao Jixiong. Then his nephew, Chao Exian, rushed all the way from Nanjing to Beijing and began to make various preparations for the assassination. In the room, the one sitting at the head was Chao Exian. He had arrived in the capital of Beiming last night, and he was naturally very familiar with this place where he had stayed for decades. He quickly contacted the Southern Ming Empire's embroidered uniform guards, and today's meeting was held. In order to prevent the news from being leaked, these embroidered uniform guards who took orders from the Southern Ming Empire didn't know what their mission was. They only knew that they were going to kill someone. Chao Exian's gaze was gloomy and cold. He first looked around at his subordinates before saying, "His Majesty Ingzong values this mission greatly. Once it's completed, I can guarantee that all of you will enjoy glory, splendor, and wealth in the future. You only need to complete this task, and you can return to the Southern Ming Empire as meritorious subjects. And for the sake of Danning's goal, I need all of you to mobilize your most elite forces and wait for my orders. Do you understand?" Understood. Even though they didn't know who they were going to kill, they didn't need to think too much about the huge benefits. At this moment, they were blinded by the benefits of succeeding and had lost their rationality. Chapter 809. Chao Exian first arranged for his subordinates to gather elites, and then he disguised himself and made a trip to the Dong residence in the city. Although it was called a residence, it was just a slightly larger courtyard. The owner, Dong Bao, was the general of Beiming's Yongding Gate, but he was only a trifling 6th-rank military official. And this was only because Dai Zong had recently increased the treatment of generals. Otherwise, with his salary alone, it would have taken him countless years to buy a courtyard like this in the capital, where every inch of land was worth its weight in gold. The general of the Yongding Gate was just one of Dong Bao's official identities. He had another identity, a hidden chess piece that Dai Zong had left in Beiming's capital. It was only because of his low rank and the fact that there were no missions for him to do that he was able to hide himself very well. But even if he was a hidden chess piece, it would be impossible for him to live a peaceful life. With Chao Exian's arrival, his life was destined to undergo a major change. The 29th day of the 12th lunar month. The 3rd day of negotiations. Overall, the progress was pretty good. Perhaps both sides wanted to negotiate, but they were both wary of the other. Thus, many major issues had already been settled, but there were still some minor issues that required both sides to make some concessions. These matters were left to Beta Persei and the others. Yang Qindong only needed to listen to the reports after the negotiations and look at Junko's records. As a result, he was quite content, and he was able to spend more time with his 2 wives every day. However, life seemed to be filled with all kinds of accidents. Whenever a problem appeared, another problem would involuntarily pop up. It had only been a few days when the Yang Manor's housekeeper, Yang Nang, appeared outside the inner courtyard, saying that he wanted to see the 6th young master. Yang Nang was the eldest son of the Yang clan's steward, Yang Hai. Yang Hai had followed Yang Rong for many years, so there was no need to doubt his loyalty. Yang Nang had inherited his father's character, and after becoming the steward of the Yang clan manor, he had performed well and was now in charge of the immortal abode. Yang Qindong was somewhat taken aback by this sudden request, but in the end he still went to see him. Only then did he learn that the immortal abode had suffered from mass food poisoning. There were 4 tables full of 20 customers who had eaten something bad, and they refused to leave the immortal abode. Today was the 29th day of the new year. The closer it was to the end of the year, the better the business of the hotel became. Those who had money in their pockets would call their friends. When they gathered together, it was inevitable that they would eat and drink. The immortal abode, which had the best taste, the best environment, and the best way to show off one's status, became the place where everyone fought to be the first to gather. Compared to normal times, business in the immortal abode was exceptionally good before and after the new year. It wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that it was hard to find a place. Even the best locations had to be reserved a few days in advance. But in such a lively time, the sudden appearance of poisoning, one could imagine how big of a commotion it would cause. However, a mere poisoning incident wasn't enough for Yang Neng to rush back to the Yang family manor to see him. In such a large restaurant, once such a special incident occurred, they must have already taken measures to deal with it. Thus, Yang Chendong looked at the nervous Yang Neng and asked, "Speak, is there some important figure among the poisoned customers?" As soon as Yang Chendong said this, Yang Neng's eyes revealed a very surprised expression. Sixth young master is indeed formidable. Indeed, one of the 20 poisoned customers is the current imperial censor of the right, Dong Chunhua. Because such a person is involved, we do not dare to act rashly. How could we possibly invite the sixth young master over? Yang Chendong chuckled, an expression that said, "As expected, this Dong Chunhua could be considered an old acquaintance. He had once wanted to show off in front of Wang Chong and trample on Wang Chong's face, but in the end, he had naturally suffered a loss. Among the current second-rank officials, Yang Chendong and Yu Shuriwei naturally didn't get along, so Yang Chendong had gotten rid of him. The remaining second-rank official was Dong Chunhua, who had been the left deputy imperial censor at that time. Wang Chong didn't expect to meet them again, and the other party had even been promoted from deputy to official. But this time it was obvious that the other party's luck wasn't good, and Wang Chong was in the wrong. I understand. Since that's the case, this young master will personally make a trip. Since it involved a second-rank official, even if it was for the sake of face, it wouldn't be easy for an ordinary person to handle it. If Yang Chendong wasn't in the capital, it would be fine. But since if he didn't make an appearance, it would be inevitable for others to say that he was arrogant. It was best not to leave such a domineering impression. Yang Neng was naturally overjoyed that the sixth young master was going to personally make a move. He immediately went to arrange a carriage. Considering that Beta Persei was still negotiating with Jin Ing, Yang Chendong didn't want to disturb him. Instead, he called for Yang Si and 50 members of the first guard squad to leave the Yang clan manor. They were still negotiating with Baiming, and Yang Chendong didn't think that anyone would try to target him at this time. Besides, even if it was an ordinary threat, the first guard squad should be able to deal with it. In the immortal abode, the initial excitement had already died down. The incident had happened too suddenly. At the start, the 4 tables of customers were all pale and powerless, truly frightening the other customers. But when the immortal abode's resident physician came out and examined the dishes, it was determined that they had been poisoned with laxatives, not the quality of the food. This sort of thing really had happened in the past. Some people in the same industry saw that the immortal abode's business was doing so well, so they found people to poison the food in an attempt to ruin its reputation. It could be said that only people in the same industry had undisguised hatred. When this incident first happened, it caused quite a bit of chaos. But the immortal abode immediately took decisive measures. Not only did they find the best physicians to treat their customers, they also paid a considerable sum of money. When the customers didn't pursue the matter, the others naturally couldn't say anything. Not to mention, this sort of thing could happen in other restaurants as well. It wasn't strange anymore. It was just that the 4 tables of customers had some problems, and the immortal abode steward had immediately stepped out to show his sincerity. Today, all of the customers had a 20% discount on their meals. This quickly calmed everyone down, and everything returned to normal. Only the 4 tables of customers still had unsightly expressions because of their stomachs. Normally, the steward would have already apologized and paid 200 taels of silver to each person, and the matter should have been resolved. Unfortunately, the imperial censor of the right, Dong Chunhua, was among the 20 people. He didn't accept the money, nor did he have any intention of leaving. As such, the others could only sit there and accompany him. Dong Chunhua's luck really wasn't too good. The officials below him insisted on treating him to a meal when it was the new year. He couldn't refuse them, so he came. He never would have thought that something like this would happen. He was a second-rank official, yet he had to fight over a toilet with a commoner because of his stomachs. If word got out, it was truly embarrassing. After taking the antidiarrheal medicine prescribed by the physician, Dong Chunhua's condition improved a bit, and he began to think of a plan. He could be considered one of Dai Zong's trusted aides, and he'd been looking for faults with the Duke of Loyalty and Courage this entire time. Since this kind of thing had happened to him, if he didn't take advantage of it, wouldn't he be letting down all the suffering he'd suffered just now? As such, he had no intention of leaving. He sat there, waiting for Yang Qindong to appear. Then he'd have a good talk with him. Even if he could only use this opportunity to make the other party admit defeat, that would still be a very impressive thing to do. Dong Chunhua didn't have to wait for too long. An extremely luxurious carriage arrived at the entrance of the immortal abode. Then, several dozen black-clad guards appeared on both sides. Just from this lineup, everyone knew that the Duke of Loyalty and Courage had arrived. It had to be said that Yang Qindong was very famous in Baiming's capital. He was different from the other dukes, marquises, and counts. These people only had status, but they didn't have any real power. When outside, it was best to keep a low profile as much as possible. Otherwise, the imperial censors weren't just for show. They'd report you at any time. Compared to them, Yang Qindong's lineup was much larger. No matter where he went, he would instantly become the center of attention. In this regard, the imperial censors couldn't do anything about it. There was nothing they could do about it. He was the leader of an army. Who knew how many people he'd killed on the battlefield? Who knew how many people he'd offended because of this? It was only natural that he had strict security measures. Of course, the most important reason was that the soldiers he was leading weren't from the Great Ming. Moreover, Yang Qindong himself had never received any salary from Baiming. Even if these imperial censors wanted to report him, they wouldn't be able to do anything about it. When they saw that the Duke of Loyalty and Courage had arrived, a few of the diners looked toward the entrance with eager eyes. In truth, when the incident happened, there were some people who weren't afraid of the consequences and waited here. In fact, even after they finished eating, they had no choice but to call a few more people over. They wanted to see how the Duke of Loyalty and Courage would deal with Sir Dong. The carriage stopped, and a green-robed Yang Qindong stepped out. He was still dressed the same as before. If there was any change, it would be that he looked more mature. After getting out of the carriage, Yang Neng led him to a table on the left side of the first floor. In ancient times, the left side was the most respected. In the immortal abode, apart from the second and third floors, the left side of the first floor was the best location. Yang Qindong attracted everyone's attention as soon as he appeared. They wanted to see if the Duke of Loyalty and Courage would lower his head and admit his mistakes. Even if it was just a bow to Dong Chunhua, it would be a victory that he could be proud of for a long time. Dong Chunhua, who was originally sitting there calmly, didn't know why, but when he heard footsteps outside and saw the diners suddenly stop and look outside, he began to feel inexplicably nervous. When Yang Qindong's figure completely appeared in front of him, he suddenly stood up. If it weren't for the fact that his face was still pale and bloodless, it would be hard to believe that he had already lost half his life from vomiting and diarrhea. You're tuning in to the Journey of the Soul YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.